Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. Have you ever noticed how the silence in a house feels different at night? I didn't expect the question to come from myself, but there it was, hanging in the air, unanswered. It was a strange thought, almost trivial, but something about it kept gnawing at the back of my mind. Maybe it was the sudden stillness around me, or maybe the sound of my own voice echoing in the emptiness of the apartment. The apartment. It had seemed perfect when we first moved in, spacious, bright, and in a quiet neighborhood. The walls were freshly painted, the floors spotless. No one had lived here for months, which should have been a good thing, but in hindsight, it felt as though the place had been waiting for us. We barely unpacked when I first heard it. A soft tapping sound coming from beneath the floorboards. At first, I chalked it up to the house settling, the creaks and groans of a building still adjusting to its new occupants. But as the days passed, the noises didn't stop. They grew louder, more distinct, as if someone, or something, was knocking from the other side of the wall. I didn't say anything to Claire at first. I didn't want to sound paranoid, or worse, like I was imagining things. But as I sat alone in the living room one evening, the sounds grew more insistent. It wasn't a random tapping anymore, it was rhythmic, almost deliberate, like something, or someone, was trying to get my attention. The noise seemed to come from directly beneath me, and the floor beneath my feet hummed with an energy I couldn't explain. I stood up, almost instinctively, and pressed my ear to the floor. Nothing. The tapping had stopped. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had missed something, that I was too late, that whatever had been there was now watching me. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Just the house settling. But the stillness that followed, the way the apartment seemed to close in around me, didn't feel natural. It felt wrong. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again. Only this time, it wasn't a tap. It was a scraping sound, like claws against wood. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It was coming from the walls. Slowly, methodically. My breath hitched. Was I just imagining it? I turned toward Claire, hoping for some reassurance, but she was fast asleep beside me, her breathing steady and peaceful. How could she sleep through this? I pulled the covers over my head, trying to block out the sound. But it wouldn't stop. The scraping continued, becoming more erratic, as if whatever was in the walls was trying to escape. My mind raced with possibilities, all of them equally absurd. A rat? A raccoon? But no, this felt different. It felt deliberate, calculated, as if the thing in the wall knew exactly what it was doing. I couldn't take it anymore. I shot out of bed, my feet hitting the cold floor, and hurried to the living room, my heart hammering in my chest. I had to find out what it was. I had to see for myself. The apartment was dark, shadows stretching across the walls. I stood still for a moment, straining to listen. There it was again, the scraping. It was louder now, almost frantic. I walked towards the wall where the sound seemed to originate from, my hands shaking. I pressed my ear to the drywall. It felt alive, pulsing, vibrating, as though something was trapped inside, clawing its way out. I recoiled, my stomach churning. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I didn't want to wake Claire. I didn't want to acknowledge that something unnatural was happening here. I pulled away from the wall, my mind racing for an explanation. It had to be a pipe, or maybe old wiring in the walls. Anything that made sense. But I couldn't ignore the feeling, the cold sensation creeping up my spine as I backed away. Then I saw it. A shadow. It flickered in the corner of my vision, a silhouette that didn't belong. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the empty apartment. My breath quickened. Was I losing my mind? That's when I heard it again. This time, it wasn't from the wall. It was closer. From under the floor. I stumbled backward, my eyes wide with fear. I needed to get out of this apartment. I needed to get Claire and leave. But when I turned to go back to the bedroom, I froze. The door was slightly ajar. I was certain I had closed it. I always closed it. The scraping sound stopped and the silence returned. But this time, the silence was worse. The kind of silence that fills you with dread, the kind of silence that presses down on you, suffocating. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I felt as if something was standing right behind me, waiting, watching. The silence stretched on. And then, from the walls, I heard the whisper. Help me. The whisper lingered in the air, hanging like a foul scent, curling around my thoughts. Help me. The voice was barely audible, distorted as if coming from the very core of the walls themselves. My body froze, rooted to the spot, my heart a hammer in my chest. I couldn't even bring myself to breathe. The silence returned with a snap, so sudden it felt like the world had just paused, holding its breath. I took a step back, my legs shaking. It was almost impossible to comprehend. Was I losing my mind? I blinked rapidly, trying to clear the images in my head to make sense of what had just happened. But there was nothing. No rational explanation. Just the hollow scrape of something behind the walls, the whisper, and the feeling of eyes on me, eyes that didn't belong. My feet moved before I could even think. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to get out, away from the walls that felt like they were closing in around me. I turned back towards the bedroom, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was behind me. Watching. The door to the bedroom was still ajar, like it had been waiting for me to come closer. I hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath, pushing through the fear. I had to tell Claire. She needed to know. I couldn't face whatever this was alone. But as I approached the bedroom, I froze. Claire was still lying in bed, just as I had left her, her breathing steady and deep. But there was something different about her position. Her arm was hanging over the side of the bed, her fingers brushing the floor as though she had been reaching for something. Claire? I whispered, stepping into the room. My voice felt wrong in the silence, too loud, too real. She didn't respond. Her face was turned away from me, her features soft in the dim light. I felt a cold prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the hair standing up. It wasn't just the silence that unnerved me, it was the stillness of her body, the way it seemed, too still. I crossed the room slowly, reaching out to touch her shoulder, but I stopped just short. There was something off. Something I couldn't quite place. Claire? I said again, this time louder, shaking her gently. Her eyes fluttered open. But they weren't the eyes I had known. There was something wrong with them. Something empty. "Do you hear it?" she whispered, her voice hoarse, as though she had been speaking in her sleep. Her lips trembled. "It's coming for us." I backed away, my mind reeling. What the hell was happening? Before I could say anything, the floor beneath us groaned, a deep, bone-rattling sound that made the whole apartment shudder. The walls seemed to exhale, and the air grew colder. Something was moving beneath us. The scratching had returned, louder now, like the claws of some monstrous creature crawling toward us. "Claire, we need to leave." "Now," I said, my voice tight with panic. She didn't move. Her body remained frozen in place, her gaze locked on something just beyond me, her pupils wide and unblinking. I turned to follow her line of sight, but there was nothing there. Just the shadowed corners of the room, the faint gleam of moonlight filtering through the blinds. A bang! I spun around. The door to the living room slammed shut with a force that rattled the windows. I darted towards it, my heart thudding in my chest, but it wouldn't open. It was as though the door had been sealed shut from the other side. I tugged at the handle, desperate, but it wouldn't budge. "Claire!" I shouted, turning back to her. She was still staring, her eyes wide and unblinking. She didn't seem to hear me, her expression blank and distant. The sound from beneath the floor was louder now, and the walls began to creak under the strain. It felt as though the apartment itself was alive, its foundation groaning and shifting. My breath quickened, my pulse pounding in my ears. I had to get out. I had to escape. I turned and ran towards the window, hoping that somehow it would be my way out. But just as my fingers touched the glass, I heard a noise, something that was both inside and outside the room. The whisper, barely a breath, but it was enough. "Help me." It came from everywhere and nowhere at once. My body stiffened, and a chill ran through my veins. The voice, it was coming from the walls again, but this time it wasn't alone. There was a scraping sound, like nails dragging across metal, and a low, guttural growl. I felt the vibrations in my bones, as if something was crawling closer, inch by inch, through the very fabric of the apartment. I turned to face Claire, my throat tight with fear, but she was gone. The bed was empty. The silence pressed down harder. The walls seemed to close in on me, the shadows twisting, becoming thicker. The floorboards creaked. The walls groaned. I wasn't alone anymore. I stumbled backward, my legs giving way beneath me as panic surged. My breath came in ragged gasps, and for a moment, I couldn't tell if I was dreaming or if the nightmare was real. Claire was gone, vanished into thin air, as if the walls themselves had swallowed her whole. My hands trembled as I reached out, desperate to feel something, anything. But there was nothing. Only the oppressive silence. The room felt impossibly cold now, the air thick and suffocating. I turned in a frantic circle, searching for an explanation, for any sign of life, but the apartment had turned into a tomb. The whisper had stopped. The scratching had ceased. All that remained was the suffocating stillness, punctuated by the sound of my own heartbeat. Then I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible shuffle, like the dragging of feet across the floor. It came from the living room. My heart skipped a beat, and my body tensed, frozen in place. The sound was faint but distinct, like someone was moving, just beyond my sight, just out of reach. I took a step forward, my eyes scanning the dimly lit room. Every shadow seemed to twist, every corner darker than before. I had to know. I had to see what was happening. With a forceful breath, I pushed myself towards the door of the living room. My hand hovered above the doorknob, my pulse thudding in my ears. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming, like 1,000 invisible eyes were trained on me. My fingers gripped the cold metal of the knob, and I twisted. The door creaked open. The living room was empty, but the air was thick with an oppressive weight, like something was lurking just beyond the threshold. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning beneath my weight. It wasn't just the silence that unsettled me, it was the feeling of displacement, as if the very room I had entered no longer resembled the one I had left just moments ago. Something was wrong. I could hear it again now, the faintest whisper, like a voice trying to break through the thick walls around me. The sound was coming from beneath the floorboards. My stomach dropped. There was no denying it now. The scratching, the whispers, the growls, they weren't just figments of my imagination. They were real. But what was causing them? I dropped to my knees, my hands shaking as I ran my fingers along the edges of the floor, feeling for a crack or a gap. There had to be something beneath the surface, something that had been hidden from view, something that had been waiting. My fingers brushed a small seam in the wood, barely noticeable, and I pressed harder. The boards shifted slightly, creaking ominously. A breath caught in my throat. The sound was closer now. Too close. The whispering became clearer, more insistent. It was almost like it was speaking directly to me. "Help me. Get out. They're watching." I tore at the floorboards, panic taking over as I pried at the edges with my bare hands. The scraping sound grew louder, more frantic, as if something beneath the floor was trying to escape. My heart pounded as I ripped the final boards away, exposing a small, darkened hole in the ground. I leaned in, peering into the darkness. And that's when I saw it. Two eyes, wide and unblinking, staring back at me from the blackness. At first, they seemed lifeless, like a doll's eyes, empty and unfeeling. But as I stared longer, the darkness shifted. The eyes twitched. A hand, a pale, bony hand, slowly emerged from the shadows, fingers curling as if reaching for me. I screamed, scrambling back, but the hand didn't stop. It kept reaching. I could hear the sound of breathing now, labored and ragged, coming from the darkness. And then I saw it. A face. It was distorted, an almost human face, but wrong. It was like a patchwork of different features, too many eyes, too many mouths, twisted into shapes I couldn't comprehend. It wasn't alive in the way I understood life. It was something else. Something ancient. I pressed my back against the wall, my breath coming in frantic gasps. My mind was racing, struggling to process what I had just seen. This was impossible. This was a nightmare. I had to leave. Now. I turned and ran back to the bedroom, but the door slammed shut before I could reach it. Panic surged, my chest tightening as I pounded on the door with my fists. But it wouldn't open. The walls seemed to pulse around me, as if the apartment itself was alive, breathing, shifting. The scratching from below intensified, louder, faster. It was coming from everywhere, echoing through the walls, the floor, the ceiling. "Claire!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Claire, where are you?" There was no answer. Only the sound of movement, the rustling of something alive beneath the floor. I stumbled backward, my mind spinning. I was trapped. There was no way out. No escape. And then I heard it again, the whisper. But this time, it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from inside my head. "Help me." I closed my eyes, shaking my head. The words felt like a hand on my throat, suffocating me. I couldn't tell where the voice was coming from, whether it was clear or something worse. I pressed my palms against my ears, but the voice wouldn't stop. It only grew louder. "Help me. They're coming for you." And then everything fell silent. I stayed motionless for what felt like an eternity, my ears ringing with the silence that had abruptly fallen over the apartment. I dared not move, not even an inch. The air was thick with something unnameable, something that made every breath feel like it was being drawn from the deepest, darkest corners of the earth. "They're coming for you." The whisper was gone now, but its presence lingered in my mind, haunting and real. I pressed my palms against my ears, trying to block out the memory of that voice, but it echoed still, trapped in my thoughts. I tried to focus. My heart was racing, my pulse erratic. The fear that had once felt like a distant shadow now consumed me completely. I had to think. I had to get out. But there was no way. The apartment had become a labyrinth of confusion and terror. The door that I had pounded on, trying to escape, was now nowhere to be seen. The walls had shifted, contorted, and I had no sense of where I was anymore. I stumbled to my feet, my legs shaky as I tried to steady myself. The shadows of the apartment stretched unnaturally, their edges warping as if they were alive, breathing, pulsating. And then I heard it again. A faint scraping sound from below, like nails dragging against the floorboards. The noise came from every corner, every crack. It was closer now. I looked down at the floor beneath me, my chest tightening in fear. The wooden planks were starting to splinter, as though something was pushing against them from beneath. A low groan reverberated through the room, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy shifting just below the surface. I backed away slowly, my eyes never leaving the floor. A chill ran down my spine. The air had grown impossibly colder, and the smell of damp earth filled my nostrils. The floor creaked under my weight as I moved, but the noises from below intensified. It wasn't just the scraping now. There was something else, something more. Something alive. The floorboards in front of me buckled, and I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. And then, with a sickening crack, a hand emerged. Pale, skeletal fingers scraped the wood, their sharp tips digging into the planks. I froze, unable to tear my gaze away from the sight. The hand was followed by an arm, thin, brittle, its skin stretched tight over the bones. The muscles twitched as it moved, pushing its way further through the floor. I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. My mind raced, trying to find a way out, but there was no escape. No way out of the apartment, no way to outrun what was coming. And then, the figure emerged fully. A body, slumped and twisted, its eyes hollow and black, staring at me with a malevolent intensity. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, as though it was savoring my terror. Its mouth opened, wide, impossibly wide, and let out a low, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't human. It was something ancient. Something that had been waiting, hiding in the walls. "You shouldn't have come." The voice was in my head again. But this time, it wasn't just a whisper. It was clearer, louder, resonating deep within my bones. The figure raised its head, its hollow eyes locking onto mine, and I could feel the coldness of its gaze penetrate my very soul. Get out. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, my feet glued to the floor as I watched the creature drag itself closer. Its limbs moved in unnatural angles, contorting as it crawled across the floor. Its skin scraped against the wood, leaving a trail of grime and rot behind it. The smell was unbearable, like decay, like something long dead. And then it spoke again. "Help me." I finally found my voice. "Claire." I screamed, but my words were drowned out by the rasping, tortured breaths of the creature. The figure moved closer still, its mouth curling into something that resembled a grin. "She's gone." The words cut through me like a blade. My chest tightened, my lungs burning as if I couldn't breathe. I thought of Claire, of her laugh, her warmth, everything that made this apartment feel like a home. And now, she was gone, consumed by the same darkness that had swallowed everything else. I turned, desperate, searching for a way out, but the room seemed to stretch, the walls closing in, suffocating me. The floor beneath me felt unstable, like it might collapse at any moment. The creature's hand shot out, fingers curling around my ankle, dragging me back toward the hole in the floor. I kicked, thrashing wildly, but its grip was unyielding. My skin burned where it touched, and the coldness of its touch seeped into my bones. "Don't fight it." I had no choice. I had to fight. I had to survive. Summoning every ounce of strength I had left, I managed to wrench my foot free from its grasp, stumbling back towards the door. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The image of that creature, its eyes locked on mine, haunted me. I threw the door open, ran into the hallway, and didn't stop until I was outside. The air was damp and cool, but the world outside felt different. The apartment complex, no, the entire block, seemed to be watching me, the windows dark and lifeless. The streets were empty, eerily silent. There were no sounds of life, no distant hum of traffic. Just the oppressive stillness that seemed to follow me. As I turned to look back at the apartment building, I saw something in the window. A face. It wasn't my reflection. It was Claire's. I stumbled backwards, my breath ragged, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't believe what I had just seen. Claire, her face, pale and twisted in the window, staring out at me like a dead thing. But how? She was gone. I'd left her in that apartment. Or had I? Was it her? Or something else, pretending to be her? The world around me seemed to blur. My mind raced, spinning in circles, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The face in the window had been too real, too familiar. I wanted to turn away, to escape, but my legs felt like lead. My vision was narrowing, like I was suffocating, as though the weight of this nightmare was too much to bear. "You should have stayed inside." The words whispered in my head, but I couldn't tell if they were my own thoughts or something else. The sounds, the whispers, the figure in the floorboards, they had all been leading to this moment. I was too terrified to think straight, too disoriented to trust anything I saw or heard. My gaze locked on the apartment building, as if drawn to it by some invisible force. The face, Claire's face, was still there, staring out at me. I couldn't tear my eyes away. The more I stared, the more I felt something inside me snap, something deep, primal. I couldn't escape. I couldn't run far enough. I had to go back. No, I couldn't. But somehow, I found myself moving, my body moving against my will, my feet dragging me toward the door of the building. It wasn't right. Everything in me screamed to stop, but the pull was too strong, like a magnet yanking me forward. My mind screamed at me to turn around, but my legs betrayed me. The door to the building creaked open as I approached. The lobby was dimly lit, eerily quiet. The air felt thick, heavy with something I couldn't quite place. I moved forward, one step after another, my pulse racing, but the closer I got to the stairs, the louder the noises became. Faint whispers at first, just beyond the edge of hearing, like they were coming from inside the walls themselves. I was hearing things. I had to be. But then I heard it, clear this time, a soft tap, tapping from below. It wasn't just the walls. It was coming from underneath, beneath the building, deep within the earth itself. The sound was rhythmic, like someone, or something, was trying to get out. I froze, unable to move. The sound grew louder. The tapping turned into a scraping, a grinding of something sharp against stone. My heartbeat quickened. What was it? What was trying to break through? I knew I shouldn't be here. I shouldn't be listening, shouldn't be near this building at all. But I couldn't stop myself. The scraping stopped. There was silence. But then, a voice. It was Claire's voice. At least, it sounded like her. Help me. It was weak, distant, but it was unmistakable. My blood turned to ice. I ran forward, rushing up the stairs without thinking, the sounds of my footsteps echoing in the empty halls, as though the building itself was holding its breath. I reached the apartment door. It was closed, but it didn't look the same as before. The wood was warped, as though it had been bent by some unimaginable force. The cracks in the door were wider, and through them I could see something moving, shadows, twisting and shifting, writhing in a way that made my stomach churn. I couldn't stop now. I couldn't leave her there. Not like this. With shaking hands, I grabbed the doorknob. It was cold, unnaturally cold, but it turned easily. The door creaked open, and the smell hit me first, a musty, damp odor, like old earth and decay. But it was worse. Something far more sinister. I stepped inside, my heart pounding so loudly that I could barely hear anything else. The apartment was the same, but somehow different. The walls seemed to close in on me, like they were alive, watching me, judging me. The lights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to stretch and twist in impossible directions. And then I saw it. In the corner, the figure. Claire, or what was left of her, sat on the floor, her body twisted unnaturally. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, staring at nothing. Her mouth hung open, slack, as if in a perpetual scream, but no sound came out. Her fingers twitched. Her skin was pallid, almost translucent. She's not really here. The thought hit me with a force that nearly knocked me off my feet. This wasn't her. It couldn't be. But then, why did she look like her? Why was she in my apartment, trapped, twisted by something I couldn't understand? I took a tentative step closer. Her head jerked up, her eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my blood run cold. And then she spoke, though it wasn't her voice anymore. It's not just me. It's all of us. The words were a low, guttural rasp, a sound that made my hair stand on end. Her mouth didn't move, but the words echoed in my mind. I staggered backward, panic rising in my throat. The apartment was closing in on me again. The walls seemed to shift, bending around me, and the air grew thick with an oppressive weight. You're next. I didn't have time to think. I turned, running for the door. My feet were numb. The hallway stretched impossibly long. I could feel the eyes of something watching me from all around, but I didn't dare look back. I couldn't let whatever that thing was catch me. I burst out of the apartment, into the stairwell, then down the stairs, and into the empty street. But as I looked back at the building, I saw it once more, a face in the window, watching me, waiting. And this time, I wasn't sure if it was Claire's at all. Have you ever noticed how the silence in the forest changes at night? The question echoed in the stillness of the room, as if the walls themselves were considering the answer. It wasn't a particularly profound question, nor one that demanded a response, but it lingered in the air with an unsettling weight. The house, a relic from another time, stood at the edge of a forgotten town, where the trees whispered their ancient secrets and the wind carried the scent of damp earth. Its wood creaked and groaned, a constant reminder of the passage of time. Inside, everything was as it should be: dusty furniture, faded curtains, the faint smell of mothballs. And yet, there was something about this place that made the air feel thick, oppressive, as though it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. David moved through the rooms with an air of familiarity, though he had only been here for a week. He had inherited the house after his aunt's death, a woman whose life had been as quiet and mysterious as the building itself. She was a woman of routine, of silence, of secrets. Her presence was felt in every corner, but her absence now left the house feeling colder than it had ever been. The attic, where the door was slightly ajar, was one of the few places he hadn't dared to explore. His aunt had always told him not to go up there, that it was unfit for living, but the idea of a hidden space, untouched and forbidden, called to him like a soft whisper at the edge of his thoughts. The first night he noticed it, the feeling that something was off, something was watching him. It was a faint rustling sound, as if the house itself was shifting, but there was no wind. At first, he dismissed it as the house settling, but it kept coming back, always when he was alone. He tried to ignore it, but then there was the smell, like the mustiness of old books, and something sweeter, almost floral. It lingered in the hallway, right outside his room. The next day, while rifling through his aunt's old things, David found a worn photograph of her standing in front of the house. The faintest trace of something was visible in the window above her, a shadow, perhaps, or a figure, but it was too blurred to make out. His curiosity grew. That evening, as dusk fell and the house settled into its familiar silence, the rustling came again, louder this time. He stood frozen in the doorway, listening. The sound was unmistakable now, footsteps. Light, but distinct. He told himself it was just the wind or perhaps the house's age causing the sounds. But there was something unsettling about it. Something that gnawed at the edges of his mind. The attic door creaked open slowly as if it were beckoning him. He stepped forward, the chill of the air seeping into his skin, making his breath catch in his chest. And then, a shadow moved behind him. David froze. His heart pounded in his chest, the blood rushing to his ears, drowning out everything except the faint echo of footsteps. It wasn't his own. He was certain of it now. He turned slowly, almost afraid to face whatever was behind him. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, dimly lit by the waning light outside. The shadows clung to the corners, flickering like memories long forgotten. Nothing. The house seemed to breathe in the silence. The rustling had stopped, but the air felt charged now, as if something were on the verge of revealing itself. David swallowed hard, his throat dry. Was it the wind again? The old house groaning under its own weight? He wanted to believe that, but the feeling, an oppressive, crawling unease, refused to leave. He glanced back at the attic door. It was still slightly ajar, beckoning him with an almost malicious allure. But it was more than just curiosity now. It was fear that tugged at his every nerve. Why had he never felt this way before? Why had his aunt, in all her strange silence, never let him up there? Slowly, he reached for the door handle, his fingers trembling. The door creaked open with an agonizing slowness. A gust of cold air met him as the attic revealed itself, a cavernous space filled with forgotten furniture, old trunks, and boxes piled high with things that had long since lost their purpose. But it wasn't the clutter that made his skin crawl. It was the feeling that someone, or something, was watching him from the farthest corner of the room. The shadows seemed to bend unnaturally, shifting as if they had a life of their own. His eyes scanned the attic, desperately searching for a source of the oppressive tension. He didn't know what he was looking for, but his gut told him it was there, lurking just beyond his sight. He stepped forward, his shoes squeaking on the old wooden floor. As he moved deeper into the attic, he couldn't shake the sensation that someone, was just out of reach. It was as though every corner, every shadow, held a presence that wasn't meant to be there. A cold draft swept through the room, and with it, a faint whisper, as if the air itself were trying to speak. David turned sharply. A figure. It was only a glimpse, just a flicker of movement in the farthest corner of the room. But it was enough. His breath caught in his throat. He didn't move. The figure was gone in an instant, vanishing like a shadow at dawn. But he knew what he saw. Or rather, what he thought he saw. Panic began to claw at his insides. "I'm losing my mind," he whispered, trying to steady himself. He looked around, his heart racing. The boxes, the trunks, nothing unusual. Yet, in the periphery of his vision, the shadows seemed to pulse, as if beckoning him deeper into the attic's claustrophobic corners. His mind raced. Could it have been a trick of the light? An illusion? He wasn't sure, but he wasn't staying to find out. Just as he turned to leave, a soft sound echoed from the farthest corner of the attic. A faint shuffle, followed by a low, almost inaudible whisper. He spun back around, his heart in his throat. "Who's there?" His voice cracked, betraying the fear that had suddenly taken hold of him. The whisper came again, this time clearer. It was a woman's voice, soft and delicate, as if speaking from far away. "Come closer. I'm waiting." David's blood ran cold. He stood frozen in place, too terrified to move. The temperature in the room dropped even further, the chill seeping into his bones. He could feel it now, the oppressive weight of whatever presence was in the attic, pressing down on him. The whisper faded, but the weight didn't lift. It was as if the house itself had closed in around him, trapping him in a web of silence and dread. He needed to get out, but something deep within him held him in place. As if on instinct, his eyes were drawn to the far corner again, where the shadow had disappeared moments before. There, in the darkness, a pair of eyes gleamed back at him, empty, hollow, but unmistakably aware. David's breath hitched. They were watching him. The eyes blinked, slowly, and a cold, hollow laugh echoed in the silence. David's pulse hammered in his chest as the eyes in the shadows blinked again. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It felt as though his body had been frozen in place by an unseen force. The house seemed to hold its breath, waiting for him to make the next move, or perhaps for something else too. The coldness deepened. The air became thick and suffocating, swirling around him as if it had weight. Every inch of him screamed to run, to get out, but his feet refused to obey. The eyes, those empty, unblinking eyes, stayed locked on his, their hollow gaze piercing straight through him, dragging him deeper into the attic's dark corners. Then, the whisper came again, this time closer, as though the voice was right beside him. "I see you." It wasn't a friendly statement. It wasn't a simple observation. It was a warning. And it was enough to break the spell that had gripped him. David snapped into motion, spinning around toward the attic door. He had to leave. He had to get away. His mind raced, adrenaline flooding his system, but his legs felt heavy, sluggish. The fear had numbed him, turned his limbs into lead. He stumbled toward the door, desperate to escape, but as he reached for the handle, the door slammed shut with a deafening thud. His breath caught. The entire attic was suddenly plunged into darkness. The dim light from the hallway outside disappeared, leaving him in pitch blackness. The whisper, now muffled, echoed through the room, impossibly close. "You can't leave." A flicker of movement in the dark. It was the figure again, just beyond the edge of his vision. He could feel it now, its presence pressing against him like a weight, suffocating, cold, and yet it was also strangely familiar, like something he had known once, long ago. He backed away from the door, his hands scrambling against the walls in search of any way out. The shadows shifted and flickered around him, growing more solid, more alive with each passing second. He wasn't alone in the attic. He could hear the soft rustling of fabric, the scrape of bare feet against the wooden floor. His heart thundered in his chest as he turned, his breath coming in ragged gasps. In the corner, the outline of a figure stood, tall, slender, almost human, but with a strange, otherworldly presence that made his skin crawl. The woman in the shadows. Her face was pale, almost translucent, her features blurred, but her eyes, they were not like the empty ones he had seen before. No, these were full of life, but hollow with something ancient, something wrong. And they were fixed on him. The whisper came again, this time louder, more insistent. "You found me." David's mind spun in a vortex of panic. No, this isn't real, he told himself. This is just in my head. But even as he tried to convince himself, the figure stepped closer. Her movement was unnatural, jerky, like a puppet on invisible strings. Each step she took left the air colder, heavier. The more she approached, the darker the room became, until it felt as if the light itself was being swallowed by her presence. "Why are you here?" David croaked, his voice barely a whisper, as though speaking too loudly might provoke whatever this thing was. She didn't respond immediately. She simply smiled, her mouth stretching unnaturally wide, too wide for a human. Her smile was wrong. It was empty. It was cruel. "Why did you leave me?" Her voice was thin, like the sound of a broken wind chime. "Why did you leave me alone?" David's breath hitched in his throat. The words didn't make sense. They felt like an accusation, but not one that belonged to him. His mind raced, trying to piece together something, anything, that made sense. "Left me alone?" The woman took another step forward, and in that instant, the memories hit him like a wave, drowning him in realization. The attic wasn't just an attic. It wasn't just a forgotten space. This place had memories. His aunt's memories. And that face, it wasn't unfamiliar. It wasn't a stranger's face. It was his aunt's. She had been here. She had been trapped here, maybe even worse than trapped. "You never saw me," the woman said, her voice laced with sorrow. "But I saw you. Every time." David's blood ran cold. He turned to run again, his hands pounding against the door, but it wouldn't open. The more he struggled, the more the shadows closed in around him, and the woman's voice echoed in his ears like a dark lullaby. "You can't escape. I am the attic. I am the silence. I have always been here. And now, so will you." The air grew thick, suffocating, and David gasped, his thoughts fraying as panic overwhelmed him. His vision blurred, and everything around him seemed to twist into a distorted version of reality. The walls pulsed with dark energy, and he felt himself being pulled into the blackness. Then, just as quickly as it all began, everything went quiet. David gasped for air, his lungs burning as though he had been suffocating for ages. The oppressive silence that had swallowed the room now stretched into a painful quiet. His hands were still gripping the door, the cold wood pressing against his palms, but the air around him had changed. The shadows, once thick and heavy, now seemed to recede, retreating into the corners of the attic like a forgotten dream. The woman, the figure that had been standing so close, was gone. Just gone. David's heart pounded in his chest, erratic, unsure whether to trust the sudden stillness. His mind was reeling. What had just happened? Was that real? He stumbled back from the door, nearly tripping over a stack of old boxes. His legs felt weak, his head spinning. He needed to leave. He needed to escape before whatever was in this house, whatever she was, found him again. He turned quickly, ready to run down the stairs, but then... a sound. Not the whisper, not the voice. The creak of floorboards behind him. David froze. There was someone, or something, behind him, in the dark of the attic, moving ever so slowly, deliberately. The noise was soft at first, almost like the sound of breath, shallow and rhythmic, but it was growing louder. Closer. David turned, his hand trembling on the edge of the door, preparing to run, but again, before he could act, the attic went dark. Not just dim. Dark. Total blackness. He couldn't see his own hand in front of his face. The room had swallowed him whole, leaving him stranded in a void, isolated and cut off from any escape. His breath quickened. Panic was rising again, hot and sharp, threatening to overwhelm him. "Help," he whispered, the words strangled by fear. But the house seemed to mock him, no answer. No sound. Only silence. Then, again, a flicker. A brief flash of something, a figure just beyond his reach, standing still in the oppressive blackness. He could sense it more than see it. It was there, just out of his vision, but he knew. He felt it. A low, unsettling laugh trickled through the shadows, chilling him to the core. "Please," he begged, though he didn't know who he was pleading with. The room seemed to close in tighter, the walls shifting, pressing inward. His pulse raced in his ears. "I don't want this. I just want to leave." And then, in that instant, the light returned. The dim glow from the hallway outside filtered through the cracks in the door, casting long shadows into the room, but the attic was empty. The figure, the woman, was gone again. For a moment, David stood there, motionless, disbelieving. His hands, now clammy, slid down the door as he tried to regain his bearings. He glanced around the attic, searching for any sign of life, any indication that what he had seen wasn't a trick of his mind. Nothing. But something in the air had changed. The quiet that followed was not peaceful. It was heavy with foreboding. He could feel it now, underneath the floorboards, beneath the very walls that had once seemed so familiar. There was a presence here. Not just in the attic, but in the entire house. A presence that watched. That waited. David swallowed, his throat dry. The feeling of being followed, watched, was too strong to ignore. He couldn't shake it. His nerves screamed at him to leave, to get out of the house, but as he made his way toward the stairs, something caught his eye, something on the floor near the doorway. A small, delicate object. He knelt down, his fingers trembling as he picked it up. It was a silver ring, old, tarnished, and clearly worn. But what caught his breath was the engraving. Faint but unmistakable, it read, "For eternity." David's heart raced again, this time for a different reason. His thoughts reeled, desperately trying to piece things together. He recognized it. He had seen this ring before. It was his aunt's. And yet, it wasn't possible. He had seen it in the woods months ago when he had buried her things after her passing. He had found it, lost and forgotten, in a place where it didn't belong. But now here it was, lying in the attic, exactly where the woman had appeared. The realization hit him like a cold slap to the face. It wasn't just that she had been here. His aunt had never left. David stood up quickly, the ring clutched tightly in his hand. His mind was a whirlwind of questions, of terror. He needed answers. He needed to understand why he had come to this house, why he was being hunted by the past. And that woman, the one who had stood in the corner of the attic, so familiar and yet so foreign, wasn't just a ghost. She wasn't just an apparition. She was a part of this house. A part of him. The realization sank deep into his bones. And in that instant, a voice came, clear and soft, but full of malice. "You should have never come back." The voice echoed in David's mind like a scream trapped in the silence, reverberating through his thoughts, sinking into his bones. "You should have never come back." It wasn't just a voice, it was a presence, ancient and suffocating, wrapping itself around his mind, pulling him back toward the very heart of the house, toward the attic where it all began. The ring in his hand felt heavier, colder, as if it were drawing him into a darkness he couldn't escape. His fingers clenched tighter around it, desperate for some connection to reality, some reminder that he could still control what was happening. But the ring was growing colder with each passing second, and the house seemed to pulse with a life of its own, beating in rhythm with his panicked heart. David swallowed hard, his throat dry as dust. He couldn't just stand here. He needed to understand. He needed to know the truth before whatever she was took everything from him, just as it had taken his aunt. The stairs creaked under his feet as he moved toward the door, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him, threatening to crush him. He glanced back over his shoulder, half expecting the figure to be standing in the doorway, waiting. But there was nothing. Nothing except the oppressive feeling of being watched. His mind was racing, struggling to piece together the puzzle that seemed to stretch on forever. The house had always been strange, old, silent, filled with memories that didn't seem to belong to him. But the attic was where everything began to unravel. His aunt's ring, the whispers, the figure in the shadows. David didn't know where to go from here. The answers were too far out of reach, just beyond the edge of his perception, teasing him with glimpses but never allowing him to fully understand. And yet, the pull to uncover more, the pull to face whatever lay at the heart of this haunting, was irresistible. He took a deep breath, then turned to head down the hallway, his steps unsteady. The house felt different now. The walls seemed to close in tighter, the air thicker, and the floor beneath him felt as if it were sinking with every step. It was as though the house itself was alive, watching him, reacting to his every move. David's eyes darted to the side, his mind screaming that something wasn't right. Then, he saw it. At the end of the hallway, a door stood ajar, its faint light spilling out into the dim corridor. He hadn't noticed it before, but now it seemed as though it was calling to him. The door was familiar, though he couldn't remember ever seeing it. The air around it seemed to tremble, to hum with a strange energy that made his pulse quicken. It was the door his aunt had kept locked. The door he had never been allowed to open. With trembling hands, David approached it. His heart raced as he pushed the door open, the creak of the hinges echoing like a warning. Inside, the room was empty, yet it wasn't. The walls were lined with dusty old bookshelves, the air heavy with the scent of old paper and forgotten secrets. But in the center of the room, sitting alone in the dim light, was a single chair. And on the floor beneath it, a thick, dark stain. David's breath caught. He knew what it was. He didn't need to see more. The stain was too familiar. It was the same stain he had seen when he had arrived at the house, a mark on the floor that had haunted him since he first stepped inside. His aunt's blood. But why? Why had she left this mark in the house she loved? Why had she kept him from the truth all these years? The air around him felt colder now, like the house itself was breathing through him. He stepped closer to the chair, his pulse quickening. His thoughts were a blur, but the need to understand, truly understand, was overpowering. And then, the room shifted. The walls around him seemed to distort, stretching and contracting as though they were breathing, alive. The floor beneath him creaked, groaned, and the shadows in the corners deepened, stretching toward him. In that moment, a new voice whispered, low, guttural, filled with anger. She could never leave. David's eyes widened. The voice wasn't like the others. It wasn't soft or sorrowful. It was dark. It was wrong. And then, before he could react, he saw her. The woman from the attic. But this time, she wasn't just a shadow. She was real. Her figure loomed in front of him, her features sharp and twisted, her eyes wide open, filled with an ancient, furious rage. Her lips were drawn back into a grimace, and her hands, long and twisted, reached for him. David stepped back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He wanted to scream, but no sound came. The walls were closing in, the air thick and heavy, suffocating him. The woman's eyes locked onto his, and he felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread wash over him. You should never have come back, she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. Now you will stay. David stumbled backward, his heart racing. His hands reached for anything to stop the darkness closing in around him. The house was alive. It wasn't just an old building. It was a tomb. And he was trapped inside. Have you ever noticed how silence changes in the woods at night? The air feels heavier, like it's holding its breath, just waiting for something to shift. That's how I felt when I first stepped into the old house. It wasn't just a building, it had a pulse, a strange rhythm that I couldn't quite place. The wooden beams creaked underfoot, the floorboards groaning as if the house were waking up after a long slumber. And the attic. I had been warned about the attic, though no one ever said why. It was just off limits. I hadn't been in the house long before I started hearing things. A faint rustling in the walls. A low, almost inaudible sound, like something or someone moving just beyond my reach. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, its old bones creaking in protest. But then there was the smell. A faint, metallic scent, like old copper, that seemed to linger in the air no matter where I went. It was unsettling, sure, but nothing to be too worried about. Yet, the longer I stayed, the more I felt it. Eyes on me. Watching. Even when I was alone, I felt like there was someone else in the house with me. Someone who moved when I wasn't looking, someone who knew my every step. I tried to ignore it. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination until I saw it. One night, while walking down the narrow corridor, I caught a glimpse of someone in the reflection of the old mirror at the end of the hallway. A woman. Her pale face, almost translucent, gazed back at me from the shadows. The moment our eyes met, she vanished. I froze. My breath caught in my chest, heart pounding as I spun around, expecting to find her standing behind me. But there was nothing. The hallway was empty. Just a trick of the light, I whispered to myself, trying to calm my nerves. But that feeling, it didn't go away. It only grew stronger, more insistent. Every night, it felt like the shadows were deeper, the silence heavier. Like I was being followed by something I couldn't see, something that was always just out of my reach. I knew I had to go up to the attic. I didn't know why, but the need to understand, to find out what was happening, was overwhelming. Something in that room was pulling me in, and I couldn't stop myself from going there. I had never been up the stairs leading to the attic before. My aunt had always kept it locked, and I had learned early on not to ask about it. But now, the door at the top of the stairs seemed to beckon me, its old wooden frame dark and worn. I hesitated for a moment, heart hammering in my chest. The rest of the house felt so still, so alive in a way I couldn't explain. The silence was suffocating. With trembling hands, I reached for the door handle, my breath shallow, my mind racing. And then, just before I could turn the knob, I heard it. A soft, distant whisper. "You shouldn't be here." I froze, the blood draining from my face as the world seemed to tilt. The voice was faint but unmistakable. A woman's voice. My hand faltered, but I couldn't pull away. I had to know. I had to see what was behind that door. With a quick motion, I pushed the door open. The attic was dark, the air thick with dust and the scent of something long forgotten. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, and I could almost feel the weight of the silence pressing in on me. As my eyes adjusted, I saw her. She stood in the far corner of the room, a figure shrouded in shadow. Her long, tangled hair fell over her face, obscuring her features. But her eyes were the only thing visible, wide and unblinking, staring directly at me. For a moment, I couldn't move. My legs were frozen, my breath caught in my throat. She tilted her head slightly, as though studying me, and then, without warning, she was gone. Disappeared into thin air, as though she had never been there at all. The room was empty. Silent. I wanted to run. To scream. But instead, I found myself stepping inside, drawn forward by some unknown force. And then I saw it, a small, broken ring lying in the corner of the room, half buried under dust. I didn't recognize it at first, but as I knelt to pick it up, a chill ran down my spine. It was my aunt's ring. I'd seen it before, sitting on her finger when she had passed away all those years ago. But how? I wasn't the only one in the house anymore, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to be. I couldn't sleep that night. My mind raced in circles, each thought tangled with the one before it. The ring. The woman in the attic. Her eyes. Everything felt wrong, out of place. My hands shook as I tried to piece together what was happening, but the more I thought about it, the more everything seemed to blur. The air in the house was thick, heavy, as though it had absorbed the secrets of those who had lived here before me. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination. My grief over losing my aunt had to be playing tricks on me. But that whisper, that fleeting figure, it felt too real. I couldn't ignore it. I had to know more. I had to confront whatever it was that was haunting this place. By morning, the events of the night before had already started to fade from my memory, slipping into the haze of disbelief. But as I stepped into the kitchen, there was something off. The air was still thick, like the house had been holding its breath overnight. And then I saw it. On the kitchen table, in the same spot where I had left my keys, was a small, withered book. It was old, the pages yellowed with age, but it was the writing that caught my eye. It was in a language I didn't recognize, the letters jagged and strange, as though they'd been carved into the paper rather than written. My heart skipped a beat. The house was full of secrets, and this book, this thing, felt like the key. I reached out to touch it, and the moment my fingers brushed the cover, the temperature in the room dropped, sending a shiver down my spine. My breath clouded in front of me as the silence deepened, pressing in from every corner. Why did you come back? The words weren't spoken aloud, but they echoed in my mind, as if they had been there all along, waiting for me to hear them. I snapped my hand away from the book, but not before a single page flipped open, revealing a sketch. A crude drawing of a woman, her face distorted, twisted in a way that seemed wrong, unnatural. Her eyes, wide and staring, just like the woman in the attic. I couldn't tear my eyes away. The more I looked at the drawing, the more it felt like the woman in the attic was staring back at me from the page. I slammed the book shut, my pulse pounding in my ears. The whispering had started again, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. It was coming from somewhere deep in the house, her voice, unmistakable. It wasn't just in my mind. I had to go back to the attic. I didn't want to, but the pull was too strong, too overwhelming. There was something I had missed, something I had to find before it consumed me entirely. I made my way to the stairs, the familiar creaking of the house beneath my feet now a constant companion. As I climbed higher, the air grew colder, the smell of old wood and dust sharp in my nostrils. The door at the top of the stairs loomed in front of me, as if waiting. I reached for the handle, and this time, my fingers didn't tremble. The moment I stepped into the attic, the shadows seemed to grow, pressing in from all sides. The room felt wrong, as though the walls themselves were shifting, bending, just out of view. And there she was again. The woman. Standing in the far corner, her pale face still hidden beneath her tangled hair, but her eyes were fixed on me, unblinking. This time, I didn't freeze. I couldn't. There was something about her presence that demanded action, demanded a response. Who are you? I managed to croak, my voice barely a whisper. What do you want? For a moment, there was no response, just the thick, suffocating silence that had become all too familiar. And then, she moved. Slowly, deliberately, as though every step was part of some ancient ritual. I watched, frozen in place, as she glided toward me. Her movements were fluid, but unnatural, like she wasn't entirely bound by the laws of this world. The closer she came, the more the shadows around her seemed to shift, like they were alive, wrapping around her like a cloak. Her face, my God, her face, was no longer hidden by her hair. It was gaunt, hollow, like the skin had been stretched too tightly over her skull. And yet, her eyes, those dark, empty eyes, bored into mine, unblinking, as if searching for something. "You shouldn't have come back," she whispered, her voice hoarse and faint, as if it were being carried on the wind. "You never should have come back." I couldn't breathe. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my feet wouldn't move. My body was frozen in place, my heart pounding in my chest. Suddenly, the temperature dropped again, the room growing impossibly cold. My breath formed clouds in front of me, each exhale a puff of white in the oppressive darkness. "It's too late," she murmured. "You're already part of it now." Before I could react, the shadows closed in around me, pulling me toward her. I tried to scream, but the air was thick in my lungs, choking me, suffocating me. My hands reached out, desperate to claw my way free, but it was like the darkness itself had taken hold of me. The last thing I saw before everything went black was her face, those hollow eyes staring at me from the shadows. When I awoke, the attic was empty. The shadows were still there, lingering, but the woman, she was gone. I was lying on the cold, wooden floor, my body trembling, and my mind a blur of confusion. I struggled to breathe, but the air felt thick, heavy with the weight of what had just happened. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a brief moment, I wondered if I had imagined it all, yet the woman, the shadows, the voice had been a product of my own fears. But I knew better. There was something real, something undeniable in what I had experienced. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, that gnawing sense of something lurking just beyond my reach. The attic. The house. The book. I forced myself to sit up, my mind racing. The book. It was still on the table. But the moment I stood, my legs buckled beneath me, and I collapsed against the wall. The house seemed to be shifting again, like it was breathing, as though it were alive and aware of my every move. I couldn't stay here. I had to leave. But the thought of stepping outside, of leaving this place, made my skin crawl. It wasn't just the house, it was her. The woman. She had been waiting for me, watching me, and I knew, deep down, that she wouldn't let me go. With a shaky breath, I stood again, forcing myself to move, to take one step after another. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I had to find it. I had to understand what this was, what she wanted from me. I stumbled back downstairs, my eyes scanning the familiar rooms, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain this madness. The house felt wrong. The walls, the furniture, even the floor beneath my feet, everything seemed to be watching me, waiting. The living room was the same as I had left it, but the air had changed. It felt thicker now, denser, and the silence, it was no longer comforting. It was suffocating. I reached for the book again. I had to know what was inside, what secrets it held. But as soon as my fingers touched the cover, the same cold sensation shot through me, freezing my bones. I opened the book, and this time, the words were clearer, more insistent, as though they were calling to me. She is not of this world. She was never meant to be. But she belongs to this place. And she will never leave it. The words burned into my mind. I could feel them settling deep inside me, wrapping around my thoughts like a vice. I had to get rid of the book, had to destroy it, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. It was like the book had a hold on me now, a pull that I couldn't resist. I turned the page, and this time, the drawing was different. The woman's face was clearer, more defined, and there was something in her eyes, something that didn't belong. Her expression was not just one of anger or malice, but of sorrow, deep, heartbreaking sorrow. She wasn't just a haunting presence, she was a prisoner, bound to this place, this house. And I was starting to understand why. I could hear the faint whispering again, distant but unmistakable. Her voice. It wasn't just a voice. It was a feeling, a pressure, pushing out my mind, making everything else fade away. "You don't understand," she whispered. "You can never leave. You're already part of it." The room began to spin. The walls seemed to close in on me, and I stumbled backward, my heart racing, my breath quickening. The air was suffocating now, thick with something I couldn't name. I had to get out. I had to. I turned toward the door, but something stopped me. A shadow, her shadow, was blocking the exit, stretching across the floor, too large, too wrong. The temperature in the room plummeted, and I could see my breath in front of me, the mist swirling like smoke. The whispering grew louder, and this time, it wasn't just a whisper, it was a scream, a low, guttural sound that rattled my bones. I could feel her presence closing in on me, suffocating me. "You're already mine," the voice breathed. "You can't escape." I was paralyzed, unable to move, unable to breathe. The darkness around me deepened, the shadows crawling closer, the woman's eyes still staring, watching, judging. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The room went still. The whispering ceased. The cold lifted. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air, my hands shaking uncontrollably. But as I looked up, something caught my eye. On the table, beside the book, was the ring. The one I had thrown in the woods. The one I had left behind. I reached for it, my fingers trembling as I picked it up. It was warm now, as though it had been sitting in the sunlight for hours. The twisted metal gleamed in the dim light of the room, but there was something wrong about it. Something off. I looked up, my eyes scanning the room, but the woman was gone. She wasn't in the shadows. She wasn't in the corners. She was gone. For now. I had no idea what was happening, no idea why the house felt so alive, so wrong. But one thing was clear, I wasn't alone. And as long as I was here, she would be watching me. Waiting. The ring was cold now, and yet its presence burned in my hand. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow alive, pulsing with an energy I didn't understand. It was as though it had always been there, a part of this house, a part of me. I turned it over and over in my fingers, the twisted metal feeling oddly familiar, like it had once been mine, or perhaps something I had always been meant to find. But that thought was wrong. This was no ordinary ring. It was a trap. I had to leave. I had to get out of here before the house swallowed me whole. But as I looked toward the door, my feet rooted to the floor, I knew I was no longer in control. The house had become something more, something alive. The walls whispered. Not in words, but in feelings, flashes of dread, of sorrow, of something ancient. Something that had always been here, waiting, watching. I took a step toward the door, but the floor creaked beneath me, the sound too loud in the oppressive silence. She was still here. I could feel her presence, like a shadow following my every move. There was no escaping it. No escaping her. The woman in the attic. The house groaned as if it were breathing, settling deeper into its foundations, and suddenly, I heard it, a sound so faint I thought I had imagined it. A whisper. "Don't go." I spun around, my heart thumping in my chest. The room was empty. There was nothing. Just the dim light creeping in through the drawn curtains. But I knew I wasn't alone. I turned back to the ring, my fingers tightening around it. What was I supposed to do? What was the connection? What did the house want from me? The whisper came again, louder this time, more insistent. "You can't leave. You're part of this now. The house remembers you." I dropped the ring. It fell with a soft thud onto the wooden floor, rolling slightly before coming to rest by the edge of the room. But its pull, its power, didn't lessen. It called to me like an anchor tethered to my soul. I backed away from it. But then the attic door creaked open. It wasn't a loud noise, but it might as well have been thunder in the silence. I froze. The attic. The place where it all began. The place where she was, where they all were. I could feel the weight of the house bearing down on me, the pressure of something ancient and dark pressing in on every side. And yet, I couldn't resist. The pull was too strong. I walked toward the door, each step slower than the last, as if I were walking toward my own doom. The air grew colder the closer I got, and I could hear my breath coming out in shallow gasps. The shadows seemed to grow longer, curling around me, waiting. And then I stepped inside. The attic was exactly as I had left it, but now it felt different, alive. The shadows here moved, shifting and twisting as though they had minds of their own. The air was thick with the smell of something old and decayed, and the silence was so deep it almost suffocated me. I couldn't see her, but I could feel her. Watching. Waiting. I moved further into the room, my eyes scanning the shadows. My feet carried me toward the far corner, where a faint, pale light glimmered just beyond the edges of the darkness. Then, in the farthest corner, I saw it. A small, dusty mirror leaning against the wall. It was covered in cobwebs, the glass cracked in places, but there was something about it, something that drew me in. I couldn't take my eyes off of it. The mirror. It wasn't like any other mirror I had ever seen. It wasn't just a reflection. It felt different. Alive. I approached it cautiously, my breath caught in my throat. The moment I looked into the glass, the world around me seemed to vanish. For a split second, everything was still. The house. The shadows. Time itself. Then, the woman appeared. Her face was distorted, twisted in a way that made my stomach churn. But I couldn't look away. Her eyes locked with mine, and I felt a cold wave wash over me, as if her gaze had pierced straight through me. She was standing in the reflection, but not in the way she had been before. This time, she was reaching for me. The reflection of her hand stretched out toward me, her fingers long and gnarled, a sickly pale color. She beckoned me, her movements slow and deliberate. I felt a surge of panic rise in my chest. I stepped back, but my feet wouldn't move. The room around me seemed to close in, the walls warping as if the house itself was reacting to what I had seen. "You can never leave," she whispered, her voice now a low, distorted hum. "You're mine. You always have been." The reflection of her in the mirror grinned, a sharp, twisted smile that didn't belong to a human. And then, the mirror began to tremble. The glass cracked further, the sound like the snap of bones. I turned to run. But before I could make it to the door, the room tilted, the floor buckling beneath me. I felt my body fall, my mind reeling with dizziness as the shadows pressed in tighter, swallowing the light. The last thing I heard before everything went dark was the sound of footsteps. Soft. Slow. "You belong here," she said, her voice echoing in the darkness. And then, nothing. I woke to the smell of dust and decay, the heavy, suffocating air pressing in on me. My body felt like it had been flattened, as if I had been lying under the weight of the entire house for hours. Every inch of me ached. I tried to move, but my muscles were stiff, my limbs unwilling to obey. I forced my eyes open, blinking against the dim light filtering through the cracked attic windows. It took a moment for the world to come into focus. The attic was silent. Too silent. The mirror was gone. Dawn? My pulse quickened as I sat up, panic clawing at my chest. The attic, the house, felt different now. It was as if something had shifted. The oppressive heaviness was gone, but it had been replaced by something else, emptiness. Hollow. Like the house was no longer merely a place. It was alive. I stood shakily, my body still weak, and stumbled toward the corner where the mirror had stood. Nothing. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, everything was as it should be, but something felt terribly wrong. I could feel it in my bones. She was still here. I reached out, running my hand along the wall, feeling for something, anything. My fingers brushed against an odd shape in the dark. A door. A door I hadn't seen before. My heart pounded, the sound in my ears louder than my breath. It was the only thing in the room that felt like it didn't belong, that felt wrong. The door was hidden in the shadows, its wood dark and smooth, with an old, tarnished handle. No handle should look like that, so familiar. It was as if it had always been there, waiting for me to find it. I hesitated, but I had no choice. I had to know. I reached for the door, the cold metal biting at my fingertips, and twisted. The door creaked open. The room on the other side was just like the attic, only colder in a way that gnawed at my insides. The air was thick with the scent of mildew, but something else lingered. Something sweeter. Sickeningly sweet. It didn't make sense. The house had always been old, but this room, it felt ancient. A forgotten place. A place she had left behind. I stepped into the room, my breath shallow. The floorboards groaned beneath me, and the walls seemed to sway, breathing in sync with my pulse. There was a single chair in the middle of the room. A wooden chair, aged and worn, its back curved like the spine of a beast. The seat was covered with a thick layer of dust. I couldn't take my eyes off it. I don't know how long I stood there, rooted to the spot, before I realized it. The walls, the ceiling, even the floor were covered in something. Something alive. The symbols. The symbols were everywhere. They were carved into the wood, etched into the walls, scraped into the beams above me. They were old, their lines faint from years of neglect, but I could see them now. They pulsed with a soft, eerie light, shimmering in the dimness like they were breathing, alive in their own right. I could hear her again. "You're mine," she whispered from the shadows. I turned in a panic, my eyes darting to the walls, the floor, anywhere but the chair. I felt her presence closing in on me, surrounding me, wrapping around me like a suffocating shroud. But there was nowhere to run. The chair. It was pulling me toward it. I fought against it, trying to resist, but it was no use. The closer I got to the chair, the more I could feel it in my chest, deep in my gut. A gnawing hunger, a need, like I was drawn to the very heart of the house itself. I had no choice but to sit. I sank into the chair. It was cold, but not in a normal way. No, this was different. This was the kind of cold that crawls under your skin, the kind that makes you feel empty. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. Then, the walls shifted. The symbols began to glow brighter, pulsating with an unnatural rhythm. And I heard it, her voice again, clear now, but not from any specific place. It was everywhere. You're part of me now. You always have been. This is your home. You belong here. And then, I saw it. In the corner of the room, just beyond my vision, a shape was emerging from the shadows. A figure, tall, thin, hunched. Its movements were slow, deliberate. As it came closer, its form becoming clearer in the eerie light. The woman. She was standing in the doorway now, her face almost human, but her eyes, those eyes, no. They weren't human. Her mouth curled into a smile, but it wasn't a smile of warmth. It was a smile of recognition. She knew me. She knew me better than I knew myself. Her fingers stretched toward me, her skin pale and translucent, almost glowing in the dark. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but sit here, frozen in place, unable to move. But I couldn't. I was part of the house now. And the house, it would never let me go. Have you ever noticed how the silence of the forest changes at night? I used to think it was just the absence of sound, the chirping of birds replaced by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. But tonight, something felt off. Something different in the air. It was like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. The house sat at the edge of the woods, isolated from the world. My grandparents' home. It was old, weathered, the kind of place that creaked and moaned as if it had its own heartbeat. But despite its age, it was always a place of comfort. At least, that was before the change. Clara, I whispered, looking out the window into the moonlit trees. My grandmother had always insisted on leaving the windows open at night, letting the cool breeze drift in. But tonight, the breeze felt heavier, thicker, like it was carrying something with it. Clara's chair, usually rocking gently by the hearth, sat still. My grandfather, too, was silent in his corner, staring into the fire with an expression I couldn't quite read. I think we're about to have a guest, he muttered, his voice rough with age. A guest? I asked, raising an eyebrow. It was late, too late for anyone to be traveling through these woods. Grandfather's eyes flickered to the window, his gaze sharp despite his years. Yes, a last guest. I didn't know what he meant by that, but his tone carried a weight I couldn't ignore. He wasn't the superstitious type, but there was something in the air tonight, something I couldn't place. Before I could ask any more questions, the sound of a knock echoed through the quiet house. 3 knocks. Not loud, but distinct. It was a sound that made my blood run cold. A sound that shouldn't have been there. My grandmother, who had been sitting silently beside the fire, suddenly stood up. The guest, she said, her voice calm, as though this was a normal occurrence. I followed her to the door, feeling my heart race as she opened it. And there he stood. A man, tall and gaunt, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. He looked ordinary enough, but there was something off about him. His clothes were old-fashioned, as though he belonged to a different time, and his eyes, There was something hollow about them. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," the man said, his voice smooth but unsettling. "I've been traveling for quite some time. Could I stay for the night?" There was something in his eyes that made me hesitate. A warning, or perhaps a question I wasn't ready to answer. But before I could speak, Clara, Eva the gracious host, stepped forward. "Of course, you may stay. We have plenty of room." She was too welcoming. Grandfather shot her a look, one I couldn't read, but it was clear he wasn't happy about this. Yet, he said nothing. The man entered without another word, his presence somehow filling the space with an unspoken tension. As the door shut behind him, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had just crossed a line. Something had changed. The air felt heavier now, oppressive. I glanced at Grandfather. His face was pale, his hand gripping the edge of his chair. "This isn't right," he muttered, but his words were lost in the stillness that hung in the air. The man, the guest, sat down in the corner of the room, his eyes never leaving us. It felt as though he was studying us, looking for something. I couldn't tell if it was the man himself or the feeling in the house, but something in the room had shifted. And I wasn't sure we were ready for whatever came next. The fire crackled in the hearth, the only sound breaking the oppressive silence that had fallen over the room. The man sat in his corner, his eyes still fixed on us, though he didn't say another word. His presence filled the room, suffocating the air as if he belonged here, had always belonged here. Clara and Grandfather exchanged uneasy glances, but neither spoke. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, unable to shake the feeling that we were being watched, observed not just by the man in the corner, but by something else. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but even that noise felt distant. The house seemed to have a strange stillness to it, like it was holding its breath, waiting. "So, where are you coming from?" I asked, trying to break the silence. My voice sounded louder than I intended, but it didn't seem to faze him. The man didn't immediately respond. He took his time, as if weighing his words. "I've been traveling for quite some time," he finally said, his tone smooth but distant. "The roads are long, and the night is cold. This house, well, it seems to offer shelter." His words didn't seem to match the eerie calmness that clung to him. I couldn't tell if he was being evasive or just odd. Either way, my unease deepened. Grandfather cleared his throat, his voice gruff. "There are many houses in the area, but this one is special. We don't often entertain visitors." The man didn't respond to that. He simply sat there, his eyes never leaving us, his hands folded neatly in his lap. He didn't seem to move, but somehow he was more present than ever. Clara, Eva the hostess, stood up and walked toward the kitchen. "I'll prepare some food," she said, her voice too bright, too forced. She was trying to maintain normalcy, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. She was nervous, and that only made me more so. I watched her disappear into the kitchen and turn back to the man. Something about him was unnerving, something beyond his strange appearance. I felt like he was waiting for something, like he was biding his time. Suddenly, the man spoke again, his voice low and almost whispering. "You don't need to be afraid of me." The words struck me like a cold wave, and for a moment, I felt paralyzed. How did he know what I was feeling? Was it that obvious? Was I showing my fear so plainly? "I'm not afraid," I managed to say, though I could feel my heart racing. I wasn't sure if I was lying to him or to myself. A faint smile tugged at the corners of the man's lips, but it wasn't comforting. It only made him seem more alien, more dangerous. Just then, a loud thud echoed through the house, coming from upstairs. My pulse quickened, and I turned toward the stairs, but the man was already looking in that direction, his eyes cold and unblinking. "Don't worry about that," he said, as if he had read my mind. "It's nothing." But the way he said it, the way his voice dropped in pitch, made it sound like it was something we should be worried about. Grandfather stood up abruptly, his old bones creaking as he moved. "I'll check on it," he muttered. He didn't wait for any response from the man, but his eyes lingered on him for just a moment longer than necessary. As he ascended the stairs, Clara returned from the kitchen, carrying a tray of food. Her hands were trembling, but she tried to hide it by keeping her movements smooth. "Dinner is ready," she said, her voice too steady. I nodded, but my appetite had completely disappeared. I couldn't stop thinking about the noise upstairs. And then, that feeling, the one that had been gnawing at me since the moment the man walked in, only intensified. There was something off about him. Something that didn't belong. I glanced at Clara, trying to read her expression, but she avoided my gaze. Before I could speak, a sound from upstairs interrupted me. A creak. Then another. It wasn't a noise from the house settling, it was someone walking. Grandfather's voice, low but clear, filtered down from above. "Who's there?" The man's eyes flickered up toward the ceiling, his expression unreadable. "Your grandfather is a brave man," he said softly, almost to himself. "Do you know him?" I asked, suddenly feeling as if I was missing something. The man smiled again, but this time it was colder, more deliberate. "I know more than you think." The words hung in the air, thick and heavy. I couldn't understand what he meant, but I didn't want to know. I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep up the pretense that everything was normal. And then, the unmistakable sound of footsteps came down the stairs. But it wasn't Grandfather. It was something else. Clara turned pale, her hands frozen mid-motion. What is that?" she whispered. The man stood up slowly, his smile widening, as if he were waiting for something. Waiting for this moment. And now was when the house seemed to groan, as if it were alive, reacting to the presence of the stranger who had come into our lives. The footsteps stopped at the bottom of the stairs. My heart pounded in my chest, and Clara's hand trembled on the tray she still held. The man, standing across the room, was the only one not visibly shaken. He merely watched us, his gaze unnervingly calm. The door to the hallway creaked open, and Grandfather appeared, his face ashen. His eyes, wide with confusion, met mine, but he didn't speak. His breath came in shallow gasps, like he was trying to regain control over something terrifying he had just witnessed. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Grandfather didn't answer immediately. He looked at the man in the corner, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of recognition, something deep and primal in his expression, like he had seen a ghost. The stranger's lips twitched. "You were always a difficult one," he said softly, as if addressing Grandfather, though the words seemed to cut through the still air like a blade. Grandfather shook his head slowly, as if trying to dispel a bad memory, then finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "There's something upstairs, something," he faltered, looking back toward the stairs, the same confusion and fear in his eyes. I took a step forward, compelled by a mixture of dread and curiosity. "What's up there?" I asked, my voice shaking more than I intended. The man's smile was too cold, too knowing. "It's not what's up there that you should fear," he said cryptically, his gaze flickering to Grandfather for a brief moment. "It's what's in here." He pointed to his chest, the motion deliberate, "that you should worry about." I felt a chill wash over me, and it had nothing to do with the draft from the cracked window. My skin prickled, and the silence in the room deepened, suffocating. The fire crackled in the hearth, but the warmth felt distant, as if the room itself had become a hollow shell. "Let's just sit down," Clara said suddenly, her voice too high, like she was trying to keep herself calm, though it was clear she wasn't. She gestured toward the table. "We can eat and talk. We'll figure this out." Her words were shaky but insistent. But no one moved. I couldn't stop staring at the man, unable to pull my gaze away from the intense, unsettling calm in his eyes. There was a glint there, something dangerous. I didn't know who he was, but I could feel it. He wasn't just a traveler looking for shelter. He was something far more sinister. A sound interrupted the tension, the softest scraping noise coming from the upstairs hallway, just beyond the open door. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it sent a wave of panic through me. I could feel my pulse racing, my thoughts swirling in a haze of dread. Grandfather's face tightened. "It's him," he muttered under his breath, barely audible. His hand gripped the railing of the stairs, knuckles white. The stranger didn't respond to this, but his eyes darkened for just a moment. He moved slowly, deliberately, toward the door that led to the hallway, his every step measured, like he was in no rush. "Don't go up there," Clara said sharply, her voice trembling. It's not safe." But the man didn't stop. He reached the doorway, pausing only to glance back at us, his smile barely there, as though he was savoring some private joke. "I don't need your permission," he said, his voice low and cold. Then, without another word, he stepped into the darkness of the hallway. I stood frozen, torn between the overwhelming urge to run and the need to understand what was happening. The silence that followed was suffocating. No footsteps. No breathing. It was as if the house itself had gone still, holding its breath with us. Suddenly, the door to the upstairs room slammed open with such force that it rattled the walls. The man's figure, silhouetted against the dim light, was framed in the doorway. His eyes gleamed, and his voice echoed from the shadows. "It's not what you think," he said, his voice carrying the weight of something ancient, something that didn't belong here. "But it is time you learned the truth." I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. It was like I was trapped in his gaze, unable to break free. Grandfather seemed to snap out of his trance and lurched forward, his voice frantic. Don't listen to him." His words were a warning, but they were too late. The man's figure started to move toward us. And that's when I saw it, behind him, a shadow. Not just a shadow of the man, but something larger, darker. It shifted in the doorway, and I felt it before I saw it, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I could hear my breath, shallow and ragged, and yet the sound of my heart pounding was drowned out by the terrible sensation that someone was coming for us. Clara gasped, her eyes wide with terror. "What is that? What is that thing?" The man's smile returned, colder now. "You were never meant to see this. But now you have." I felt the floor beneath me tilt, as if the house itself were tilting, spiraling into something far beyond comprehension. The air grew thick, almost unbearable. I had to get out of here. We had to get out before it was too late. But it was already too late. The air was thick with fear as I stood frozen in place. The shadow behind the man continued to grow, stretching and warping as though it was alive, as though it had its own consciousness. Clara's breath hitched in her throat, her hand pressed tightly to her mouth in an attempt to stifle the scream that was desperate to escape. Grandfather's voice, though shaky, cut through the thick silence. "No, not yet. You can't." The man turned to look at him, his face twisting into something almost unrecognizable, something that was no longer human. The eyes that had once gleamed with cold amusement were now filled with an ancient hunger, as if the creature before us had been waiting for this moment for far longer than we could comprehend. "I warned you," the man said, his voice low and menacing, the words heavy with a promise that neither of us were prepared to hear. "The time for secrets is over." And then, with a fluid motion that defied reason, he stepped aside, revealing what lurked behind him. The shadow in the doorway was no longer just a shadow. It had taken form, distorted, almost human, but wrong in every way. Its skin was pale, translucent, stretching too thin over bones that were too sharp. The shape wavered like smoke, as though it existed in multiple dimensions at once. Its eyes were wide and black, devoid of any light or hope, sucking in all the warmth in the room. The creature's mouth opened, impossibly wide, and from it came a sound, a scraping, guttural noise, as if the very air around us was being torn apart. "Run!" Clara screamed, her words shaking, but her body paralyzed. She couldn't move. None of us could. I wanted to move. To grab her hand and pull her to safety, to flee before it was too late, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the thing in front of me. It wasn't just terrifying, it was wrong in a way that made no sense, a violation of everything I thought I knew about the world. The man, the thing, smiled again, but this time there was no humor in it. "You didn't think I was just a traveler, did you?" he asked, his voice laced with contempt. "This house, it's always been mine. You were just guests. What are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. My body was screaming for me to run, but I couldn't seem to force it to move. The creature behind him shifted, taking a step forward, and that's when the truth hit me like a cold wave. It was feeding. The air grew heavier as the thing reached out with long, skeletal fingers, its claws brushing the floor, dragging itself toward us, each movement fluid and unnatural. Grandfather's breath quickened. We made a mistake," he muttered, his voice distant, as if he were speaking more to himself than to us. "You always do," the man replied. "You should have never invited me back." And just like that, it all started to make sense. The stories my grandfather had told me as a child. The whispered warnings he gave me about never bringing strangers into the house, about always being careful who we let inside. It wasn't just superstition. It was real. The man, the creature, it had been here before. Decades ago. And my family had somehow trapped it. Now, it was free. "Run," Grandfather whispered again, but this time his voice was cracked, almost broken. He was no longer the man I had known. There was no strength in him anymore, only fear and regret. Clara, still paralyzed by the horror of it all, seemed to snap out of her trance when she saw the creature's hand reach for her. She screamed, but it was too late. The creature's fingers brushed against her arm, and the room seemed to bend, the walls warping as it made contact. The sound that followed was worse than any nightmare I could have imagined, flesh being torn, a low, sickening crack. Clara's scream turned into a choked gasp. I saw her body go limp, her face pale as death, her eyes wide with disbelief. "No!" I shouted, but my voice was drowned out by the overwhelming sound of hunger. It filled the room, consuming every corner of it. Grandfather collapsed to his knees, tears streaming down his face. His hands trembled, reaching out toward Clara as if he could somehow save her, but we both knew it was too late. There was no saving her now. I backed away, panic clawing at my insides. My mind was scrambling, trying to find a way out, but there was nothing. Nothing but the darkness, the creature, and the man who had lured us into this trap. What do you want from us?" I whispered, barely able to get the words out. The man, if he could still be called that, looked at me with a vacant, emotionless expression. "I don't want anything," he said, his voice strangely calm despite the chaos unfolding around us. "I'm simply here to finish what I started." Grandfather's sobs echoed in the now empty room. His shaking hands reached toward me, desperate. "Get out. Please. Run." But I couldn't. Not yet. My feet were frozen to the floor. Every fiber of my being screamed to escape, but something in the back of my mind, the part of me that was still able to think, knew that we weren't the first to be trapped here. And we wouldn't be the last. The creature turned its gaze back to me, its eyes black holes of nothingness, and in that moment, I knew what I had to do. I had to break the cycle. Or die trying. The room seemed to collapse in on itself. The air was thick, almost suffocating, with the stench of decay and fear. Clara's lifeless body, now a mere husk, hung limp in the creature's grasp. The once vibrant glow of the house seemed to drain away, leaving only shadows and a chill that penetrated deep into my bones. Grandfather's sobs grew louder, more frantic. I could see him trembling on the floor, his hands clawing at the wood, as though he were trying to dig into the earth to escape the horror that had already claimed Clara. It was too late for her. I knew that. But it wasn't too late for me, not yet. The creature shifted, its long, skeletal fingers tightening around Clara's arm, lifting her like a rag doll. Its dark eyes bore into me, and for a moment, I thought I saw something like satisfaction in those endless black depths. It didn't need to speak. The silence in the room was heavy with the promise of its next move. I had to act. My heart raced, a drumbeat echoing in my chest as I backed toward the door, my feet hesitant but moving nonetheless. The floor creaked beneath me, and the creature's head snapped toward the sound, its eyes narrowing. I froze. It was too quick. Too aware. "You think you can escape?" The man's voice rang out, cold and filled with venom. "There is no escape from this place. There never has been." I didn't turn to look at him, but I could feel his gaze like a weight pressing on my back. My mind scrambled for any possible way out, but there was no clear path. My body felt heavy, as if the air around me was turning to concrete, trapping me in place. Grandfather's voice, now a mere whisper, broke through my thoughts. You don't understand. You don't know what he is." I turned to look at him, my eyes wide with panic. "What are you talking about? What is he? What is that thing?" Grandfather's eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment, I saw something that made my stomach churn: guilt. Regret. It was a look I hadn't seen on his face before, and it terrified me more than anything else in that room. "It's not just him," he whispered, his voice cracking. It's the house. This place, it was built to trap souls. To keep them. And the man, he's the one who makes sure they never leave." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about the creature. It wasn't just about survival. It was about the house itself. The thing standing before me, this man, this monster, wasn't the true enemy. He was only the vessel. The house had been feeding off fear, off the suffering of those who entered its doors for years. It was the very structure that trapped us, that consumed us slowly, piece by piece. And now, I was caught in its web. I could feel it, creeping beneath my skin. The house itself was alive, watching, waiting. The shadows were alive. The floorboards whispered, and the walls seemed to pulse with something dark and hungry. "Run," grandfather's voice cracked again. "Get out, before it's too late." I wanted to listen. I wanted to believe there was still a way out. But I couldn't. There was something in my blood now, something that had already marked me, something that wouldn't let me leave without a price. I had to make a choice. The creature, the man, was still watching me, his eyes never leaving mine. And then, as if he were reading my thoughts, his lips curled into a smile. "You think you can outsmart the house? You think you can break the cycle?" The words were a challenge, a dare, and I couldn't ignore it. I reached for the closest object I could find, a rusted piece of metal from the broken chandelier above, and held it tightly in my hand. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. I looked at my grandfather, then at Clara's body, and then at the door. The house was alive, but so was I. And I wasn't going to let it claim me without a fight. I made my move. With a cry of desperation, I lunged at the door, slamming it open with everything I had left. The force knocked me back as the heavy wood creaked on its hinges, and for a moment I thought I had done something, anything, to break free. But then I saw it. Standing in the hallway, just outside the door, was another version of the creature, the same twisted form, but this one was even more grotesque, as if the house had given it shape. It reached toward me, its claws scraping along the floor, its mouth opening wide, its breath like the sound of cracking bones. And then the man, the first one, laughed, a slow, sickening sound. "You can't leave," he said. "None of you can." I turned to run, but the hallway stretched out before me, impossibly long, the walls closing in. The shadows danced around me, and I could hear them, whispering, calling me to stay. I didn't know how long I ran. I didn't know if there was even an end. But one thing was certain. The house had won, and I was its last guest. Have you ever noticed how the silence in a forest changes at night? The words linger in my mind, uninvited. A simple question, but one that plagues me as I stand in the dark hallway of an old apartment building, feeling the weight of something unseen. It's a place I should feel safe, a temporary home, but somehow it feels different, out of place, like a forgotten corner of time. The air is thick with dust, each breath heavy with the scent of aging wood and stale air. I want to blame it on the old structure, but deep down, I know something else is at play. This apartment, an old, barely furnished space, with worn-out floorboards and a basement that always seemed to whisper, was supposed to be a fresh start. I don't even know why we took it. A good deal, they called it. But as I sit in the living room, every creak of the floor beneath me feels like a warning. The darkness outside my window seems to stretch further each night, pulling the room deeper into shadow. A faint rustle in the hallway is enough to send a chill up my spine. I tell myself it's just the wind, just the old pipes. But then I see it. A shadow, lingering in the corner of my eye. It's quick, fleeting, but it's there. I shake my head, trying to clear the fog creeping into my thoughts. My roommate, Ben, is sitting in the chair across from me, reading. He hasn't noticed. He never notices. I'm not sure if it's a blessing or a curse. I wish I could ignore it too, but I can't. Something about this place doesn't sit right, and I feel like I'm the only one who can see the cracks in the walls, the ones that grow wider every night. Did you hear that? I ask him. He doesn't even look up from his book. What? He mutters, as if the words don't matter. Nothing, I reply, but I can feel the unease gnawing at me, growing with every passing second. The silence wraps around us like a shroud. It's thick, oppressive, but it's only a matter of time before something breaks it. The first night, I had dismissed the noise as nothing more than old house sounds, pipes groaning under pressure, the wind rattling the windows. But tonight it's different. Tonight, the quiet feels wrong. The walls seem to hum, a low vibration that shivers beneath my skin. Ben doesn't notice it. He's too busy with his books, too lost in his own thoughts. But I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me from the dark. There's something behind those walls, something in the basement. And as I glance down the hallway, the shadows stretch just a little too far, curling in on themselves like they're waiting for something. A figure? A shadow? I don't know. But it's there. I try to focus on something else, anything else, but the air feels heavier now. The world outside the window is gone, swallowed by the darkness. The house seems to pulse, breathing with the night. I should feel at home here. But I don't. The silence has changed. It's no longer comforting, no longer the absence of sound, it's oppressive, a weight pressing down on my chest. And it's worse when I try to ignore it. The more I tell myself that it's just the house, the more real it becomes. The next morning, I wake up to a strange feeling, a tightness in my chest. I can't shake the image of that shadow in the hallway, the way it had stretched unnaturally, like it was reaching for me. I tell myself I'm being paranoid. Old houses do that to you, right? They play tricks on your mind. But then again, why does the kitchen always feel colder now? Why do the lights flicker when I walk past the basement door? Ben is already gone when I wake up, off to work, as usual. I stand in the empty apartment, my footsteps echoing against the hardwood floors. It's quieter than it should be. The kind of quiet that wraps itself around you, suffocating you in its stillness. My fingers trace the edge of the doorframe, my mind wandering. The hallway stretches before me, dark and narrow. The basement door is slightly ajar. It hasn't been opened before. At least, not like this. A sliver of darkness spills from the crack, and it's enough to send a chill crawling up my spine. I can't help but stare. I want to close it, to block off whatever it is that's calling from below. But something keeps me rooted in place. My heart beats harder, louder, until it drowns out everything else. And then, I hear it. The faintest sound, like a shuffle. A scrape of something moving, dragging itself across the floor. It's coming from the basement. I step back instinctively, but my feet betray me, pulling me toward the door. My hand reaches out, trembling. Stop. The word echoes in my head. I should leave it alone. Just go to work, go out, anything to avoid whatever lies behind that door. But I don't. I open it. The basement stairs descend into nothingness, the darkness swallowing any trace of light from above. The air smells musty, like wet stone, and there's a strange heaviness in the atmosphere. I take a hesitant step forward, the floorboards creaking under my weight. Another shuffle. Closer now. I freeze, my breath caught in my throat. It's not the wind. It's not the house settling. It's a footstep, slow and deliberate. I back away slowly, but something pulls at me. Something makes me turn around, look once more into the blackness below. The coldness of the basement seems to reach out, fingers curling around my spine, pulling me closer. "Ben?" I whisper, my voice barely a murmur. No answer. Just the sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears. The door slams shut behind me, and I nearly jump out of my skin. It's the wind. It has to be. But the feeling of being watched, it lingers. Later that evening, as darkness falls again, I hear it again. The sound of footsteps. But this time, they're not coming from the basement. They're coming from the hallway. I stand frozen, my eyes wide, straining to see. The hallway is empty, but I swear I hear movement, like someone's pacing just out of view. The creak of footsteps is unmistakable, slow, heavy steps that drag across the floor. I don't want to look. I don't want to know. But my feet betray me again. Slowly, I walk to the doorway, my hand trembling as I grip the frame. The hallway is empty. But the floorboards beneath my feet shift again, a groan of wood. And I realize, too late, that the sound isn't coming from behind me. It's coming from the darkened living room. I turn sharply, my breath catching in my throat, but there's nothing there. Just the shadows stretching across the walls. My heart races in my chest, my breath shallow. It's getting worse. I can feel it. Something is moving in this house. And I'm not sure I want to know what it is. I don't think I'll be able to sleep tonight. The silence in this place is no longer comforting, it's waiting. Watching. And I don't know if I'll make it through the night. The house feels smaller now, like the walls are closing in, breathing with me. Each step I take is cautious, hesitant, as though the floor beneath me might give way at any moment. The shadows grow longer with every hour, and the silence, it isn't silence at all. It's a low, unrelenting hum that thrones beneath my skin, growing louder while I'm alone, quieter when someone else is around. Ben comes home late again, oblivious to everything. I almost envy him. His world is still whole, untouched by whatever is breaking down mine. The moment he steps in, I try to act normal, but he catches the look in my eyes, the way my fingers are shaking as I stir my tea. He doesn't say anything, but I know he's noticed. His gaze shifts to the basement door, slightly ajar, and I can tell he's wondering the same thing I've been trying not to. "You ever go down there?" I ask, my voice strained, too high-pitched. He glances at the basement and then shrugs. "Not yet." "Why?" I stop myself, unsure how to explain the feeling. "I think it's better we don't go down there." His eyes linger on the door, but then he looks away. "If you say so." He sinks into the couch, and I see the moment he chooses to stop thinking about it. I can't stop thinking about it. Later, after a quiet dinner that passes without much conversation, I lie in bed, staring at the ceiling. The darkness is heavier tonight, thick and suffocating, pressing down on me. It's as if the very air is trying to keep me in place. I hear the wind outside, but it sounds wrong, like it's caught in something. A low whistle through the cracks, as though it's trying to speak. And then, a noise. A tap. Barely audible, but enough to break the tension. I freeze, heart hammering against my chest. It comes again, and this time it's clearer, the unmistakable sound of something tapping on the floor. Soft at first, like fingers drumming on wood, and then louder. Closer. The pattern doesn't make sense. It's irregular, like it's testing the sound, drawing it out. I sit up in bed, straining my ears. The tapping continues. It's coming from the hallway. I throw off the blankets and step into the dark. My feet move without thinking, carrying me toward the sound. I can barely breathe. My body is shaking, the tension building in every muscle, but I can't stop myself. Not now. I reach the hallway, and the sound stops. It's as if the world holds its breath. Then, I call out, my voice low and shaky. I don't want to be alone. There's no answer. I step forward, my footfalls muffled against the carpet. The hallway is empty. Too empty. The shadows seem to reach out, wrapping around the edges of the walls, crawling across the floor. But then I hear it, a soft, almost imperceptible shuffle. It comes from behind the kitchen door. Without thinking, I move toward it, my pulse quickening. My fingers brush the cold brass handle. Before I can open it, the door creaks. Slowly, it begins to swing open by itself. I can't breathe. I feel the air shift, like something invisible has entered the room with me. And there, just beyond the threshold, I see it. A shape. A figure, crouched low to the ground, moving with a disturbing grace. It's not quite human. It's wrong. The shadow stretches unnaturally long as it shifts, bending in ways that shouldn't be possible. I can see it now, just barely, a face, half obscured, but its eyes, they're wide, black, and hollow. It doesn't blink. It just stares. My breath catches in my throat. I want to scream, to run, but my legs feel like they're made of stone. The figure moves closer, its fingers brushing the floor, dragging itself toward me, its body twisting unnaturally with each movement. Then, I whisper, but the word catches in my throat. The figure stops, and for a moment, everything is still. It raises its head slowly, and I can feel the weight of its gaze piercing through me. Then, without warning, it moves toward me, faster now, and I stumble backward, my body crashing against the wall. The sound of it, the way it shuffles, claws scraping across the floor, is too much. My heart is in my throat, and for a second, I can't breathe. But just as quickly as it started, the movement stops. I look down, and the floor is empty. The figure is gone. I'm left standing there, gasping for air, the silence so deafening it feels like it's suffocating me. I don't know how long I stand there, but when I finally gather the strength to move, I retreat back to my room, lock the door behind me, and sit on the bed, trembling. I don't know what I saw. I don't know if it was real. But I can't ignore it anymore. Something is down there. And it's waiting. Still waiting. It's been days since the basement door disappeared, but the house doesn't feel the same. I don't know if I've become more paranoid or if something has truly shifted, but the air feels wrong. Thicker. Every time I pass by the space where the door used to be, I can feel it pulling at me, like a magnet, urging me to look again, to open that wall and see what's hidden behind it. But I can't. I won't. Ben hasn't asked about the basement since the night I ran upstairs. He doesn't seem to notice the way I jump at every creak in the house or how I no longer want to be left alone. Maybe he's getting used to it, too. The house. The tension. Or maybe he doesn't want to face it, just like me. But it's not over. I know it's not over. There are nights when I lie awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds, the whispering of the house, the scratching of something moving in the walls, the faint tapping, just barely audible. I can't ignore it anymore. I can't pretend it's just my imagination. Tonight is different. I don't know what makes me get out of bed. Maybe it's the sound that's louder than usual, closer, like someone is walking through the hall. Or maybe it's the way the darkness seems to have weight, pressing down on me, pressing in on the room, suffocating me. I get up. There's no going back. I can't pretend I didn't hear it. I can't pretend that whatever is in this house isn't real. I stand at the hallway threshold, listening. The sounds are coming from the living room now. The tapping. The dragging. I feel like I'm moving in slow motion, my steps heavy, dragging me forward against my will. I reach the living room door and pause. The room is dark, but the shadows feel alive, shifting, moving like they have a mind of their own. I take a deep breath. Then, I open the door. At first, I don't see anything. The room is empty. Silent. Just the way it should be. But then I notice something. The corner of the room. The space where the shadows seem darkest, where the light doesn't quite reach. And then, I see it. The figure. It's not crawling this time. It's standing. The shape is taller than before, its limbs elongated, twisted in unnatural angles. The mask-like face is turned toward me, its hollow eyes locking onto mine. It doesn't move. It just stands there, waiting. My heart races, my legs shaking beneath me, but I can't turn away. I can't move. The figure doesn't speak. It doesn't need to. Its presence is enough to tell me everything. This thing is not from this world. It's something older, something that should have stayed buried. And it's here for me. I back away slowly, but it follows. Each step I take, it mirrors. The closer I get to the door, the more the room feels like it's shrinking. Like the walls are closing in, the shadows pulling me deeper into the dark. Suddenly, there's a sound behind me. The sharp crack of something breaking, something old, like glass shattering. I turn, and for the briefest moment, I see it. The basement door. It's back. The door stands in the same place it had been before, but now it's different. The edges are blackened, as if burned by something not of this world. The air around it shimmers with an unnatural energy, a heaviness that makes it hard to breathe. I don't know how it got there. I don't care. The figure takes another step toward me, its head tilting to one side, its smile widening, stretching farther than it should. I can feel its hunger, the way it feeds off my fear. I don't think. I run. I sprint for the door, my legs moving on pure instinct, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath ragged and shallow. The sound of the figure's steps is behind me, relentless, growing closer. I reach the basement door, my hands trembling as I grab the handle. I wrench it open, throwing myself down the stairs without a second thought. The darkness is suffocating, but it's familiar now. It's a place I know. A place that's haunted me. I don't stop. I keep running, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the cold, damp space. But then I stop. Because I hear something else. The whisper. It's not the figure anymore. It's something else. Something worse. A voice, soft and distant, yet unmistakably familiar. Ben. It's a whisper that calls my name from the far corner of the basement. I spin around, my breath catching in my throat. My body freezes. There, in the shadows, is Ben. He's standing there, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. But his eyes aren't his. They're empty, hollow. Just like the figure. And then, I hear the voice again. Louder this time. Ben is gone. The last thing I remember is the figure stepping into the basement behind me, the door slamming shut with a deafening crash, and then, nothing. The house is silent again. But now, I'm the one waiting. Have you ever noticed how silence changes in the woods at night? The question hangs in the air, a slow breath, a thought that refuses to leave. I've asked myself this same thing countless times since the accident. The crash. The screeching metal, the snap of glass, and then, nothing. Just darkness. It's funny how quickly the mind can forget the details of something so traumatic. But the silence always lingers. And in that silence, there's always something else. Something that doesn't belong. I remember the hospital bed, the sterile walls, the smell of antiseptic in the air. And I remember his face. Greg's face. It haunts me even now, weeks later. The way his eyes had stayed open, staring at the ceiling, like he was waiting for something that never came. Something worse than death. But it's the silence that I can't shake. It's like a shadow, creeping along the edges of my consciousness. The kind of silence that makes you feel like something is hiding just beyond the corner of your vision. That's when it started. The calls. It was late. I had just finished my dinner, the dishes still piled up on the counter. The lights in the kitchen flickered, casting odd shadows on the walls. The house felt too still, the kind of stillness that makes your skin crawl. I stood there for a moment, just listening. Then it came, the phone. It rang once, twice. An ordinary call. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I didn't recognize the number. I thought about letting it go to voicemail, but something compelled me to answer. Hello? My voice was hesitant, unsure. There was no response at first. Just a long, drawn-out silence on the other end, the kind that's heavy with expectation. Then, a crackling noise, followed by the voice. His voice. Ben? Is that you? The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My breath caught in my throat. Greg? I whispered, barely able to breathe. Greg, is that really you? The line was filled with static, but I could hear him. I could hear his voice. It sounded so real, so alive. But it couldn't be. Greg was dead. He had been for weeks. You need to listen to me, Greg's voice crackled through the phone, distorted but unmistakable. It's not over, Ben. Something's coming. Something that shouldn't be. You have to run. You have to get out. My stomach twisted into a knot. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. What are you talking about? Greg, you're... Listen. You can't stay there. It's already here. It's in the house. Do you hear it? The silence? It's already here. The line went dead. I stood there, holding the phone, my heart racing, my mind spinning. My pulse hammered in my ears as I slowly hung up the phone, not knowing what to believe, but the feeling of dread was so overwhelming that I couldn't ignore it. I tried to convince myself it was a prank, a cruel joke, a sick way of remembering him. But the way he spoke, the urgency, the fear in his voice, it wasn't fake. It wasn't imagination. The silence pressed on me again, heavier this time. It was suffocating. A pressure in the air, thick and unnatural. My eyes darted around the room, looking for something, anything, that would make sense of it. But there was nothing. Suddenly, a soft, almost imperceptible sound came from upstairs. A faint creak, like someone walking across the floor. I froze. I hadn't heard anyone come in. No footsteps, no knock at the door. And yet, that sound was unmistakable. Someone was up there. I grabbed my phone again, hand shaking, trying to call Greg's number, trying to hear his voice again. But the line was dead. No signal. My breath quickened. This wasn't right. This couldn't be happening. The creak sounded again, louder this time. It came from the hallway, right outside my door. I had to go check. I had to know. Slowly, I made my way toward the staircase, each step feeling heavier than the last. The house was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the streetlights outside. Shadows stretched along the walls like elongated fingers, grasping at the edges of my vision. The sound of the creaking continued, dragging across the floor like something, or someone, was moving closer. I reached the stairs, my hand gripping the railing, and I paused. I wasn't sure if I wanted to go up, but I couldn't stop myself. I stepped onto the first stair, and then the phone rang again. I almost jumped out of my skin. I grabbed the phone, desperate to hear something familiar, but all I could hear was static. Then, that voice again. "You shouldn't have gone up there, Ben," Greg's voice whispered from the phone, as clear as day. I looked toward the staircase, my breath catching in my throat. The creaking had stopped. But now, something else was there. Something I hadn't noticed before. A shadow. It was standing at the top of the stairs. I stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, my heart hammering in my chest. The shadow at the top of the stairs wasn't moving. It was just there, hanging in the air, dark and unnatural. My breath came in shallow gasps as I stared at it, feeling the overwhelming urge to run, but I couldn't make my legs move. It wasn't a normal shadow. Shadows, I knew, were cast by light. But this thing, this darkness, it seemed to consume the light, as if it didn't belong in the world I knew. It stretched, wavered, and then seemed to expand, like it was growing. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry, the phone still pressed to my ear. "Greg?" I whispered, barely able to form the words. "Greg, what is this?" There was a long pause, a silence so thick it felt like it could smother me. Then, the voice on the other end came through, softer, more strained this time. "You need to get out, Ben. It's too late. It's not just a shadow. It's something else. Something that was never meant to be. You have to leave now." I could barely focus on the words. My mind was spiraling, trying to piece together the events of the past few minutes. The phone call, the shadow, Greg's voice, a voice that shouldn't be there. Suddenly, the shadow shifted. It was slow, deliberate. A movement that wasn't natural. And then, I saw it, a shape within the darkness. The outline of a figure, tall, its features twisted, almost as if the shadow was trying to form itself into something real. I stepped back instinctively, a cold shiver running through my spine. My knees almost buckled beneath me, but I forced myself to stay upright. The figure at the top of the stairs was still there, but now it seemed to be leaning toward me, as though it was watching, waiting. My phone slipped from my hand, hitting the floor with a soft thud. The sound of it falling felt like the loudest thing in the world, echoing through the empty house. And then, a voice, not Greg's this time, but something far colder, rasping from the dark at the top of the stairs. "You shouldn't have listened." I tried to move, to run, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. My heart was pounding so loud I could barely hear anything else, but I could hear the slow, dragging sound of footsteps. Something was coming closer. I glanced down at my feet. My shoes were still on. I had to run. But as I looked back up, the shadow had moved. It was no longer at the top of the stairs. Now, it was standing in the doorway to the hallway, blocking my only escape. I didn't think. I just acted. My body, filled with pure panic, started running, my breath erratic as I barreled toward the back door. The sound of my footsteps, heavy and frantic, filled the house. But just as I reached the door, a voice, Greg's voice, cut through the air once more, this time louder and more desperate. "Ben, don't. It's behind you." I froze. Something cold slid across my back. A hand? No, it was too wrong. Too empty. It was the sensation of nothing, yet it felt like it was everywhere. I turned, slowly, feeling the air grow heavier, thicker with each passing second. And there, in the hallway, was the figure. It was no longer just a shadow, it was a presence, solid and yet ethereal, stretching out like dark smoke. The thing's face, or what could have been a face, was a blur, shifting, flickering between shapes, like it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. But I could feel its gaze, an intense, suffocating force. It knew me. It knew me. I took a step back, but the figure didn't move. It didn't need to. It was everywhere and nowhere. A presence that invaded every inch of space. "I don't want to die," I whispered, my voice breaking, almost inaudible. The air grew colder. The silence deepened. And then, the phone rang again. I didn't want to answer. I didn't want to hear anything else. But somehow, my hand reached for it, trembling, and I picked it up. The line crackled again, like before, but this time, I couldn't make out the voice. The words were distorted, fragmented, but I could hear the urgency in the static. It was Greg, but not quite. It was like he was fading, becoming part of the static itself. "You can't outrun it," Greg's voice echoed through the phone, barely recognizable. "It's already here." The air around me seemed to pulse with the weight of his words. The figure at the end of the hall shifted again, its form becoming more defined, more threatening. I could feel it inching closer, even though it hadn't moved an inch. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing, to focus on anything but the presence looming just out of reach. But my mind kept racing, spinning in a panic. What did it want from me? What was it? And then, in the quiet that followed, I heard it, the sound of Greg's voice, clearer now, no longer crackling, but real. "Ben, run." I didn't hesitate this time. I turned and ran for the door, my body moving on instinct, my mind barely able to keep up. But as my hand reached for the knob, the world seemed to tilt. The room spun. And in that moment, I wasn't sure if the door would even open. The darkness was closing in. The door wouldn't budge. My hand gripped the handle, twisting it with all the force I had, but it was like the door had become part of the wall, as though the house itself was rejecting my escape. Panic surged through me. I could hear my breath, ragged and shallow, the sound of it vibrating against the thick, oppressive silence. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it, just a flicker at first, but unmistakable. The figure. It wasn't standing in the hallway anymore. It was moving. No longer confined to one spot, it was flowing toward me, its shadowy form expanding, seeping like ink across a page. I wanted to scream, but the air in my lungs felt frozen, unable to push the sound out. The figure was getting closer, its shape shifting with each step, though I couldn't discern any real details, only the sense of its presence, like it was consuming the space around me. I glanced back at the phone, still in my hand, and in a moment of desperation, I pressed it to my ear again. Maybe Greg, maybe his voice could help me somehow, give me an answer. The static was deafening, but then I heard a faint, familiar sound, a voice, almost lost in the crackle. Ben, listen carefully. You have to understand. It's not a ghost. It's nothing. And it's already inside you. The words hit like a punch. It wasn't a ghost. Nothing? What did he mean? How could something that was nothing be chasing me? The figure was closer now, too close, and I could almost feel the chill of it, the absence of warmth. I didn't have time to think. I had to get out. I yanked the door again, but still, it wouldn't open. The knob turned, but the latch was stuck, like it was being held from the other side. The weight of the thing behind me grew, as though the darkness itself was breathing down my neck, waiting for me to make a move, to give it a reason to strike. I could feel the pulse of it, vibrating through the walls, the floor. My skin crawled as the temperature dropped further, the air thick with something cold and insidious. And then, as if the house itself was conspiring with the thing in the hallway, I heard a faint whisper, an almost imperceptible sound, coming from behind me. A voice I recognized. Ben. It wasn't Greg anymore. It was something else. A voice that didn't belong, yet somehow felt as if it was always there, waiting. It was a voice I'd heard in dreams, in nightmares. I wanted to turn and face it, but I was paralyzed. And then, I saw it. The outline of the figure was clearer now, its shape was still shifting, but this time, I could see it more distinctly. A long, thin arm reached out from the darkness, its fingers elongated and twisted, unnatural in their length. It wasn't human. It was something worse, something born from the very shadow it had come from. It was a thing of the void. I slowly got to my feet, still gripping the phone in one hand. I didn't know where I was anymore. The street, the houses, the trees, they all seemed alien now. A vague sense of recognition gnawed at me, but it wasn't enough to make sense of it. And then I heard it. That unmistakable sound. Footsteps. Not mine. These were lighter, quicker, as if something was running just behind me, almost too close. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Only the empty street, the cold glow of the streetlights. But the footsteps didn't stop. They were getting closer. I ran again, heart hammering in my chest, the sound of the footsteps closing in with every stride I took. But no matter how fast I moved, I couldn't shake the feeling of something just behind me, moving in sync with my every motion. My mind was unraveling. Was I imagining it? Was it just the fear, the panic, playing tricks on me? But the sound was real. The footsteps were real. I needed to get to safety. I had to find somewhere to hide. The phone in my hand began to buzz again, a jarring vibration against my palm. I glanced at the screen. It was Greg's number again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I answered, my voice trembling. Greg? What is it? Please, But the voice on the other end wasn't Greg's. It was that voice. You're running out of time, it said, and the words sent a chill so deep through me that my legs almost gave way beneath me. Before I could respond, the line went dead again. I looked around in a panic. The footsteps were gone. The oppressive silence had returned. But then, from behind me, came a whisper. You can't run forever. I turned. And there, at the end of the street, in the darkest shadow cast by the streetlight, something moved. It was tall, impossibly tall, and though I couldn't see its face, I could feel its eyes everywhere. Watching. Waiting. And I knew, then, that it wasn't going to stop. It would never stop. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure stood motionless in the distance, its shape obscured by the oppressive darkness, but I could feel its presence. The air itself seemed to tremble around it. It wasn't just standing there. It was waiting. I should have run. My mind screamed for me to turn around, to get away from whatever that thing was. But my body refused to move. I was paralyzed, unable to break free from the suffocating grip of fear. The whisper echoed again, but now it wasn't just from the darkness. It seemed to be inside my head, curling around my thoughts like a physical force. You can't run forever. The voice stretched and twisted, layered with something that sounded like 1,000 voices, a choir of the damned. It felt close. Too close. I stumbled back, my legs trembling, the sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears. But the figure didn't move. It simply stood there, watching, waiting. Then, a flicker, a brief moment when the darkness around it seemed to shift. It was subtle, like the world itself was bending to accommodate this presence. The streetlights above flickered again, casting erratic shadows across the ground. But something was different now. The air felt thinner, as if the light itself was struggling to pierce the suffocating void. I couldn't breathe. I looked down at my phone, my hand shaking violently. Another call. Another call from Greg. But this time, I didn't need to answer. The phone itself began to vibrate violently in my hand, like it was being pulled towards something. It wanted to answer, to speak. The street seemed to stretch endlessly in front of me, each step I took feeling heavier, slower, like the ground was trying to swallow me whole. The whispers increased, their words indistinguishable from one another. A cacophony of voices, all clamoring for attention, all warning me of something I couldn't quite understand. It's coming for you. It's always been here. You're too late. I snapped my head back up, my pulse quickening as the figure moved. Not fast, just a slow, deliberate step, as if it were testing the limits of my fear. The shadow that stretched from it grew longer, engulfing the street in its cold, oppressive presence. I didn't think. I just ran. I turned and bolted down the street, my feet pounding against the concrete as I tried to push myself faster, harder. I could feel the weight of something chasing me, something just behind, following my every movement. The footsteps were back, closer this time, more urgent. They were in sync with mine. Every time I took a step, it took one too. I couldn't see it. I couldn't see what was behind me, but I knew it was there. Suddenly, my phone rang again. This time, it wasn't Greg's voice I heard. It was that same whisper, cutting through the air like a blade. "You can't escape." The words rang in my ears, louder this time, like the voice was inside my head, clawing at my thoughts. I looked up ahead, desperate for something, anything, to break the madness. In the distance, I saw the flickering glow of a gas station. A small haven of light in a sea of darkened streets. I could make it there. I had to make it there. But just as I thought I could escape, the phone rang again, the vibration nearly sending it flying from my hand. I answered without thinking, my voice trembling as I gasped for air. "Greg? Please, what is happening? What do I do?" I pleaded, my voice cracking with panic. There was a long pause on the other end, followed by that cold, distorted voice. "There's no escape. It's already inside you." I screamed, pulling the phone away from my ear, the line going dead before I could even respond. Inside me. What did that mean? What was happening to me? The gas station was getting closer, but I could feel the darkness behind me, growing, closing in. I wasn't sure if I was running from something or if I was running toward my own doom. The footsteps grew louder. Closer. They were no longer in sync with mine. They were faster, more urgent, as if the thing chasing me had learned my every move. I made it to the gas station, throwing open the door and stumbling inside. The bell above the door rang as I collapsed onto the counter, gasping for air. The attendant behind the counter looked up, his face expressionless. But as his eyes met mine, something shifted. Something in his gaze flickered with recognition. "You've seen it too, haven't you?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I just stared at him, my heart racing, my body trembling. The lights above flickered once more, and in the reflection of the glass door, I saw it. The figure was standing outside, just beyond the threshold. It didn't move. It just watched. And then, with a shift in the air, it was gone. Just like that. Vanishing into the darkness. I didn't know if I was safe. I didn't know if I was still alive. But one thing was certain. I wasn't free. I woke up to silence. It wasn't the usual quiet I was used to. It wasn't peaceful. It was as if the air itself had forgotten how to breathe. I rolled out of bed, expecting the usual noise of the city, the hum of cars, the distant chatter from the cafe down the street, the occasional dog barking. But there was nothing. Not a single sound. Not even the wind. I pulled the curtains aside, half expecting to see people walking down the street, carrying on with their lives. But the street was empty. The houses across from mine were dark, lifeless. The world felt wrong. I didn't panic. Not yet. My mind raced through explanations. Maybe everyone had left for the day. Maybe something had happened, some kind of event that had cleared the streets. But then I realized it wasn't just the streets. It was the whole town. The sun was barely up, casting long shadows over everything, but there was something strange about the light. It felt off, like it was too bright and yet too dim at the same time. I stepped out onto the porch, my slippers cold against the wooden boards. I called out, expecting an answer, but the words hung in the air like a forgotten echo. No one answered. The wind started picking up, whistling through the trees, but even that sound was muffled, like it was too far away. I walked down the steps, the creaking of the wood too loud in the stillness. The town was always busy, always. But now, it felt like a ghost town. It was like the world had forgotten how to move, how to live. I wandered through the streets, past familiar buildings. Everything looked normal. The bakery was closed, the car dealership empty, the old diner locked up. But there was something wrong. The silence was oppressive, like the town itself was holding its breath. And then I saw him. He was standing by the fountain in the middle of the square, his face hidden under the brim of a worn-out hat. He didn't move as I approached, didn't acknowledge me at all. I stopped a few feet away, unsure of what to say. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. The man slowly turned his head, his eyes meeting mine. His gaze was empty, like he hadn't seen another person in years. His mouth barely moved when he spoke, his voice low and raspy. "They've crossed over," he said. "And you will, too." I blinked, unsure if I had heard him correctly. "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart starting to beat faster. "They're gone," he continued, his voice growing colder. "Everyone. All of them. They've gone beyond the edge, where you can't follow." A chill ran down my spine. This wasn't making sense. "What do you mean? Where did they go?" His eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I felt something I couldn't explain. Fear? Sadness? No, it was something worse. It was a deep, empty feeling, like I was staring into an abyss. "You'll see soon enough," he whispered, then turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the silence, growing fainter until they disappeared completely. I stood there, my thoughts racing. What did he mean? Where had everyone gone? Had I somehow missed something? I tried to call someone, anyone. My phone was dead. The battery drained completely. I didn't know how. The town felt heavier now, the silence pressing on me from all sides. Every step I took felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be here. The sun was higher now, but the shadows were growing longer. Everything was fading into something unnatural. The question gnawed at me, how could an entire town just disappear? How could everyone vanish without a trace? And then I heard it. A sound, distant but unmistakable. A soft, rhythmic tapping. My heart skipped a beat. It was coming from behind me, the same pattern over and over. I turned, expecting to see someone, something, following me, but the street was empty. The tapping continued, though, closer now, louder. It was only then that I noticed the first thing that seemed out of place. A faint smell, like something burning, but with a sharp, metallic tang to it. It wasn't just the air, everything felt wrong. The buildings, the streetlights, the very ground I stood on, it was all shifting, like the town itself was trying to shake me off. I had to find answers. But with every step, it felt like I was sinking deeper into a nightmare. I kept walking, trying to shake the feeling that something was wrong with the world around me. The tapping, that rhythmic sound, was still there, following me, echoing off the walls of the empty buildings. Each time I stopped, it stopped too. But when I moved again, it came back, louder, closer. I turned a corner, thinking I might find someone else, maybe someone who could explain all this. The street stretched out before me, just like every other street in town, except it wasn't. The houses, the signs, the trees, they were all wrong. Everything seemed just a little off, like the world was an image slipping out of focus. A part of me wanted to turn back, to head home, to lock the door and pretend none of this was happening. But another part, something colder, something deeper, urged me to move forward. I needed answers. I couldn't stop now. Not with that man's words still ringing in my ears. They've crossed over, and you will, too. I rounded another corner, my steps quickening as I moved down a street I knew well. The corner store, with its faded yellow awning, should have been right ahead. I could almost smell the fresh bread from the bakery inside. But when I reached the spot where it should have been, all I found was an empty lot. The store was gone, replaced by a deep, dark pit. The ground seemed to swallow it whole. For a moment, I stood frozen, my mind struggling to catch up. It wasn't possible. It just wasn't. And then, that tapping started again. Louder this time. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. The street was empty. No one. Just the buildings, silent and unmoving. I looked down at the ground, trying to steady myself. But something caught my eye, a small, broken piece of glass, glinting in the sunlight. I reached down, picking it up, my fingers trembling. It was a shard of something that once belonged to a mirror. As I held it, I caught a glimpse of something in the reflection, a movement behind me, just a shadow, but unmistakable. I snapped my head around, but there was nothing. No one. Just the empty, lifeless street. My pulse was racing now. Was I losing my mind? Had I gone crazy? I turned the corner quickly, hoping to find someone, anyone. But there was nothing. The street stretched on, silent, lifeless. The world around me felt like it was folding in on itself. And then, I heard it again. The tapping. This time, it wasn't just from behind me. It was from everywhere. The sound seemed to fill the entire town, echoing through the air, like it was coming from the ground itself. I spun around, desperate to find the source. And that's when I saw it. A figure, standing at the end of the street. A person. They were motionless, just standing there, looking in my direction. The shadows clung to them, making it hard to see clearly. But I could feel their eyes on me, piercing through the darkness. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice trembling. "What's going on here?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, they took a step forward. And then another. Each step was punctuated by that same, relentless tapping sound. Closer. I wanted to run. My legs screamed at me to turn and flee, but my feet refused to move. It was as if something was holding me in place. The figure took one more step, and the shadows seemed to shift around them, distorting the air. I couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, suffocating. The world around me started to bend and twist, like the edges of a dream fading away. And then, just before the figure reached me, it stopped. The tapping ceased. For a moment, there was nothing. Silence again. But it wasn't peaceful. It was terrifying, like the quiet before a storm. The figure reached up and pulled off its hat. Underneath, there was no face. Just a smooth, featureless surface, as if the skin itself had been wiped clean. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. The world around me felt like it was closing in, suffocating me. And then, in the void of that blank face, I heard the words again. "They've crossed over." I felt my body go cold. My mind was screaming, but there was no sound. just the endless, suffocating silence. And then, the figure stepped forward once more. I stumbled backward, my legs shaking, my breath shallow and rapid. The figure moved closer, its presence like a black hole, pulling everything in. Every step it took seemed to distort the world around me. Shadows stretched unnaturally, the ground beneath my feet warped and twisted. The tapping sound started again, now coming from all directions, surrounding me. My body refused to move. I wanted to scream, to run, but the words were stuck in my throat. The figure's featureless face, the blank void where its face should have been, was terrifying in its stillness. It stood there, motionless, yet its presence loomed larger with every passing second. "It's not real," I whispered to myself, trying to steady my thoughts. But the words felt hollow, like a lie I was telling myself to stay sane. Nothing about this was real. Nothing about this made sense. And yet, here I was, standing in the middle of the street, staring at a creature that shouldn't exist. The figure took another step forward. And then another. Its footfalls were soft but deliberate, like it was making sure I felt each one, each tap searing into my mind. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Suddenly, a burst of sound tore through the air, a sharp crack, like thunder, but far too close. I spun around, instinctively looking for the source, and that's when I saw it. The world behind me was bending, collapsing, as if reality itself was folding in on itself. The buildings warped and swayed, their outlines stretching and shrinking. The streetlights flickered, casting strange, jittery shadows. The air smelled different now, thick, metallic, like blood. It wasn't just the figure. The town itself was changing, becoming something else. Something wrong. The figure was almost upon me now, its empty face inches from mine. I could feel its presence more than see it. It was as if it had infiltrated my thoughts, my every fear, my every doubt. My heart hammered in my chest, my hands shaking violently. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes, the figure was gone. The street was empty again. No tapping. No presence. I stood there, gasping for air, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was I dreaming? Was I losing my mind? Was this real? The silence returned, but it wasn't the same silence from before. It was oppressive, heavy, like the whole town was holding its breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. I turned and ran. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care. I just needed to get away from that spot, from that thing, from whatever this town had become. My feet pounded against the pavement, the sound too loud, too real. I didn't stop. I couldn't. The world around me was a blur, flashes of empty streets, warped buildings, strange, flickering lights. It felt like I was running through a dream, a nightmare that refused to end. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something, someone, standing in front of me. A figure. But this time, there was no tapping. No distortion. No shadows. It was just a person. A woman. Her face was familiar, but wrong. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, staring straight at me. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her lips moved again, and I saw her eyes shift, the pupils contracting unnaturally. "She's gone," she whispered, her voice hollow, empty. "They've all crossed over." I stopped dead in my tracks, my body freezing in place. Her words felt like a weight pressing down on me, suffocating me. I couldn't look away from her eyes, Those eyes that seemed to pull me in, to drag me into some terrible truth I wasn't ready to understand. "What do you mean?" I choked out. "Where did they go?" She took a step closer, her face inching toward mine. "They're all gone. And you're next." I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, to tear myself away from her, but my feet wouldn't move. My body was frozen, trapped in the gaze of her empty eyes. The world around me started to spin. The ground felt unsteady beneath me. The buildings, the street, the air, it was all shifting again, warping into something unrecognizable. And then, just as I thought I might fall into the void of whatever this place had become, I heard the tapping again. Closer. Louder. This time, I didn't wait. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran, ignoring the woman's voice calling after me. I ran faster, faster than I ever thought I could. But the tapping kept up, keeping pace with me, following me no matter how fast I went. The streets blurred, the buildings twisted. And the only thing that was constant, the only thing that felt real, was the sound. The tapping. The footsteps. The inevitable. I wasn't alone anymore. I could feel the weight of my breath, each inhale sharp and desperate, my lungs fighting to take in the air as if the world itself was trying to choke me. The tapping was still there, relentless, just behind me, getting closer. I didn't dare turn around. I knew, deep down, that if I did, I wouldn't be able to handle whatever was following me. I had to keep running. The streets blurred past me, each corner a distorted echo of the last, like I was running in circles, trapped in the same loop, unable to break free. The buildings, once so familiar, now looked like they were made of shadows, their windows dark and lifeless. The road ahead stretched out into an endless void, no clear destination, just more of the same cold, empty street, the same tapping sound, now accompanied by a low, hollow hum that seemed to vibrate the very air. Was it just me? Was I imagining it? I couldn't trust my own thoughts anymore. I stumbled, my foot catching on the uneven pavement. I crashed to the ground, my hands scraping against the rough surface. Pain shot through me, but it was nothing compared to the fear gripping my chest. I pushed myself up, ignoring the sting in my palms, and kept running. But the tapping, it was louder now. Close enough that I could almost feel it in my bones. It wasn't just the sound anymore. It was as if the very act of moving, the very air around me, was alive with it. I couldn't take it anymore. I stopped. For a brief moment, everything fell silent. My heartbeat hammered in my ears, but beyond that, nothing. I turned slowly, my eyes darting to the shadows, expecting the worst. But there was nothing. Not at first. And then, there, at the far end of the street, barely visible through the dimming light, I saw it. A figure, standing motionless, its outline blurry, indistinct. It wasn't the same figure from before. No. This one was different, somehow more solid, more real, and yet not. Its presence pulled at the edges of my mind, like it didn't belong here, like it was a piece of something that had been ripped away and thrown into this world. I took a step back, my feet slipping in the dirt, and I froze when I saw the figure begin to move. It wasn't walking. It was gliding, floating above the ground, its form flickering like a broken image on a screen. I couldn't make out any features, just the shape of it, tall, thin, its arms unnaturally long, hanging down like limp threads. The shadows around it twisted, dancing in unnatural ways, as if they were afraid of it. "Stay away," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Stay away from me." It didn't respond. It just kept coming, gliding closer, closer still. I turned and ran again, but this time my feet felt heavy. The pavement beneath me had shifted again, the texture changing, becoming soft and uneven, as if it was made of wet sand. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I could feel the air growing thick, hard to breathe. The low hum from before returned, vibrating the ground, and I could hear it more clearly now, the sound of whispering. Soft voices, distant and unintelligible, swirling around me like a storm. I glanced over my shoulder. The figure was still there, closer than before, the distance between us closing too quickly. It wasn't even running, it was just there, in front of me, waiting. I wasn't going to make it. I couldn't keep running. There was nowhere to run. My legs gave way, and I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, my body shaking uncontrollably. I closed my eyes, the world spinning around me. But even through the terror, I couldn't help but wonder, where had everyone gone? Was this really happening? Or had I lost my mind somewhere along the way? The whispering grew louder, like it was coming from inside my head. "You will cross over, too," they murmured. "You're not meant to be here. You never were." I tried to push the voices away, but they kept coming, drowning out my thoughts. The tapping was back, faster now, almost frantic. It filled every corner of my mind, louder than the whispering. And then, suddenly, everything stopped. No tapping. No whispering. No figure. For a split second, there was nothing but silence. I opened my eyes. The street was different now. The buildings were gone, replaced by an endless stretch of empty land. No cars, no houses, nothing. Just barren, cracked earth, stretching out into the horizon. I was alone. The air was thick with something I couldn't name, something old, something wrong. The sky above me was a dull, sickly shade of gray, and the only sound was the wind, carrying that same hum in its breath. I stood up slowly, my body heavy, as if it didn't belong in this place. Was this the crossing over? Was this what the man had meant? A shadow flickered at the edge of my vision. I turned, heart racing, but there was nothing there, just the barren land, empty and cold. I wanted to scream, to ask someone, anyone, what was happening. But my voice wouldn't come. And then I saw it. In the distance. A figure, barely visible, standing in the middle of this desolate wasteland. It was waiting for me. I didn't move. I couldn't. My legs felt like they were made of stone, rooted to the ground, incapable of taking a step. The figure in the distance was still there, standing motionless in the emptiness. Every instinct I had told me to run, to turn away, to do anything other than face it. But I couldn't tear my eyes away. Something about it called to me. The air around me thickened, and the wind grew colder, carrying that same low hum that had followed me from the beginning. The ground beneath my feet seemed to pulse, like it was alive, and I felt a strange pressure building in my chest, as if the world was tightening around me, squeezing the breath from my lungs. The figure shifted, just slightly, like it had noticed me. And then it started moving. Slowly at first, then faster, as if it were gliding toward me. My heart raced, my thoughts scattered. My mind screamed for me to run, to escape whatever this thing was, but my feet refused to listen. The closer it got, the more I could see. It wasn't just one figure, it was many. All of them blurred together in my vision, their forms shifting and flickering like reflections in a broken mirror. Faces, bodies, all overlapping, none of them fully formed, all of them wrong. A voice, low, gravelly, like it was coming from somewhere deep underground, broke through the silence. "You've crossed over," it whispered. "Just like the rest." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. The rest. The ones who had vanished. The ones who had disappeared. I took a shaky step back. "What do you mean? What is this? What's happening?" The figure stopped just in front of me, its form now clearer, but still distorted. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs too long, its face a shifting blur of eyes and mouths, all moving at once, all trying to speak. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel them, crawling into my mind, making my thoughts tremble. "You were never meant to stay," it rasped. "This place, this world, it doesn't belong to you. It's not your reality." I shook my head, my chest tight. No, this isn't real. It can't be." The ground beneath me rumbled, and I stumbled forward, grabbing onto the shifting earth to steady myself. The figure stepped closer, its eyes, hundreds of eyes, staring at me, piercing me. "Real or not," it whispered, "it doesn't matter. You can't go back. You've crossed over. There's no way out." The sky above me darkened, swirling like a storm, and the hum grew louder, vibrating through my bones, filling every corner of my mind. I could hear the tapping again, closer this time, more frantic. It wasn't just a sound anymore, it was an entity, a force, pulling at everything, pushing at everything. I looked down at my hands, expecting to see them shaking, but they were fading. Faintly, like a dying echo, like they didn't exist here. I tried to scream, but the sound was lost, swallowed by the hum. "Are you going to let it take you too?" The figure's voice echoed in my mind, each word a hammer striking against my skull. "Everyone else has gone. And you? You're already halfway there." I wanted to say something, to fight it, but my thoughts were slipping away, unraveling, twisting into something else. Was I losing myself? "You'll never leave," it whispered, a smile forming on the figure's shifting face. "You're one of us now." And then everything stopped. The figure, the whispers, the hum, all of it vanished in an instant. The air grew still, suffocating, as if the world was holding its breath. I stood there, alone again, in the same barren landscape. No tapping, no voices. Just an empty silence, so heavy it felt like it could crush me. I didn't understand. None of this made sense. How could I be here? What was this place? And why did it feel like I was already gone? The figure was gone. The world was gone. But something else lingered. A feeling, a presence, just behind me, waiting for me to turn around. I knew it was there, even before I looked. And when I did, when I finally turned, I saw it. It wasn't a figure. Not anymore. It was me. Staring back at myself, but not me. The eyes, my eyes, were empty. Hollow. The face was still mine, but it was wrong. It wasn't the face I had known. It wasn't the face I had seen in the mirror. And as it smiled, slowly, painfully, my thoughts became clear, sharp, and cold. I had crossed over. I had never left. And now, I was part of the emptiness. Part of the void. The tapping started again. But this time, it wasn't from behind. It was from inside. thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.